I declare open this public hearing of the House Standing Committee on Tax and Revenue for the inquiry into housing affordability and supply in Australia. In accordance with the committee's resolution of 25th of July 2019, the audio of this meeting will be broadcast on the Parliament's website, and proof and official transcripts of the proceedings will be published on the Parliament's website. I now welcome witnesses from the Department of Communities, Housing and Digital Economy and the Department of State Development, Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning from the great state of Queensland. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Kerry Doss, State Planner and Deputy Director General, Planning Group, Department of State Development, Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning.
Mark Wall, General Manager, Strategy, Policy and Programs within Communities, Housing and Digital Economy.
Christopher Aston, Executive Director, Policy and Statutory Planning, Planning Group, Department of State Development, Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning.
Liza Windle, Executive Director, Housing and Homelessness Services, Department of Communities, Housing, Digital Economy.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. It is important to note that although your evidence is protected by parliamentary privilege, this protection cannot be enforced outside Australia. I now invite you to make a short opening statement before we proceed to questions.
Thank you very much, Chair and Committee, for the opportunity to discuss our submissions to the inquiry with you. I would like to start by respectfully acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this event is taking place, elders both past, present and emerging. The Queensland Government has long been focused on addressing the important issue of housing affordability and supply. Our state's economic recovery plan acknowledges that the COVID-19 pandemic will have substantial and long-lasting impacts. We have already seen that the impacts of the pandemic, as well as interstate migration, are adding more pressure to Queensland's housing market. You will see from our submission that planning systems play a key part, but are not solely responsible for, nor the sole answer to addressing housing affordability and supply. Projects and programs we describe in our submission are only part of the solution. The Queensland Government recognises the need to have adequate supply of appropriately zoned and serviceable land and an adequate pipeline of approvals to allow for market flexibility. Queensland is tracking land supply and approvals in South East Queensland through the Growth Monitoring Program. In 2018, the Queensland Government established a housing supply expert panel to oversee this program and to provide advice about how to appropriately manage land supply and housing affordability issues in South East Queensland. While it has been suggested that housing supply can be increased by simply upzoning properties to increase potential supply, a key matter that must be considered is the availability of supporting infrastructure. The planning for and delivery of infrastructure to support growth and development is a long-term process which requires coordinated long-term planning and investment. Zoning decisions cannot be made today and delivered tomorrow, nor can infrastructure capacity be quickly turned on or quickly reallocated to other areas. In March this year, a specialist growth areas team was created to ensure Queensland can keep up with the demand for housing and infrastructure that comes with population growth. The work of this team has identified that the cost of enabling catalyst infrastructure is a significant barrier to new development. For larger growth areas, land fragmentation results in a situation where neither local government nor a developer can afford the upfront funding of necessary infrastructure. In response, last year, the Queensland Government established a $200 million Building Acceleration Fund, which is a no-interest loan to local governments, developers and utility providers aimed at breaking the catalyst infrastructure deadlock. This fund has been instrumental in opening up a number of new development fronts. This demonstrates that such funds are instrumental in opening up large development areas sooner. While infrastructure charges on new development can add to the cost of housing, the delivery of this infrastructure is necessary to create service land for housing in the first place. In
Mr.
August
Aston,
last year-
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have very limited time with you, and I was wondering if you wouldn't mind winding your comments up so we can get to questions.
Yeah.
My apologies.
No, certainly, Chair. We'd asked that the committee recognises substantial upfront funding required to deliver first stages of new development fronts in rapidly growing areas, and that the work that local governments and the Queensland Government is doing to meet demand. I also asked that the committee examine alternative methods for funding this essential infrastructure.
Thank you. Mr. Aston, can I go directly to that? What are some of the alternative methods you would suggest?
Sorry, Chair, it's Kerry Doss speaking.
Oh, sorry, it's coming up on the screen as Christopher Aston. My apology.
No,
That's me, sorry, Chair.
Oh, sorry, that's all right. No, I should apologise. I'm calling you the wrong name. My apologies. Sorry, Kerry.
Chair, I would think there are a number of things that can be looked at, such as special rates and levies. I think the Building Acceleration Fund that the Queensland Government has put in place has shown to be useful in providing catalyst development. And there's the age-old question of how much infrastructure charges should be, given that they are something that adds cost to development. So it's a matter of getting the balance which allows a local government or a developer to be able to fund infrastructure up front to get stages of development happening.
Thank you. Mr. Doss, we've heard evidence to this committee already that the biggest constraints on housing supply, which is the long-term driver of affordability and price, are the state governments, and that they may be conflicted because of the nature of the tax systems that they rely on, being mostly stamp duty. Do you therefore think it's a bit curious that you are, out of all the states and territories that are contained in this nation, you are the only state government that was willing to front this committee?
Mr. Chair, I can't really comment on why my colleagues in other states have decided not to confront this, to talk to this committee.
But don't you think that the New South Wales state government, for example, which is the epicentre of this affordability crisis, that their Department of Planning would want us to understand why it is that prices are so high in that city?
Again, Mr. Chair, I can't begin to comment on why my colleagues in New South Wales might not have seen the advantages of appearing before this committee.
Do you think it would be unreasonable, therefore, for members of this committee to conclude that the reason that they don't want to appear before the committee to answer questions is because they've got something to hide?
Again, Mr. Chair, I cannot speculate as to the reasons why New South Wales have chosen not to appear before this committee.
Thank you, Mr. Doss. My time is now up. Deputy Chair.
Thank you, and thank you for your submission and your opening remarks. It's really interesting. So, did you just going back? You said it was a growth team that you'd put together.
Growth Areas team.
Yeah. Okay. So clearly, you put that together because it's obvious that the way that state governments release land and builders, build big, etc., isn't working because of the fragmentation, as you said, and also sometimes the slow purchase, which means it's councils don't want to deliver services. Can you just expand a bit more on that, because that's a really interesting issue?
So, sorry, you want me to expand on the growth areas team or the issues that we've seen? Okay,
the issues that you've seen that caused you to pull the growth team together.
Okay, so as you may be aware, South East Queensland is one of the fastest growing regions in Australia. What we have seen, we monitor land supply in South East Queensland. We have two key benchmarks which we seek to ensure are met in South East Queensland. One of those is that each local government area has at least 15 years of supply of land that is zoned and able to be serviced for new growth in the area. And the other benchmark we look at is that on average, there are at least 4 years of approvals that have been issued across South East Queensland to provide for growth. We find that provides enough opportunity for the market to respond across the region. What we have, however, seen after our third year of monitoring last year was that some key markets were under this 4-year benchmark. And we've been looking at the tools that local governments have at hand to be able to roll out infrastructure areas. And we find that in most cases, our growth areas are in multiple ownership, therefore fragmented, and that there are issues with getting coordination across those fragmented land holdings. And secondly, the issue is that where you have fragmented land holdings, there is usually no one individual developer who is able to fund the catalyst infrastructure that is required to open an area up. So with the growth areas team, we've been working on a growth area in Moreton Bay Regional Council area, the Caboolture West area, which will have capacity for up to 70,000 people, around about 30,000 new homes. And what we have been working on there is working with the council, working with the utility providers, and working with the landowners group to get the first stage of that development across the line. That development area has been identified for at least 10 years, and the growth hasn't started there. In this year, the state government has provided a $10.5 million interest-free loan. Unity Water, being the water and sewer provider, have also provided a similar no interest loan to get that first stage of development happening. And we are hoping that within the new year, we will see approvals for up to 3,000 new house lots unlocked in that area. So that fragmentation, a key issue, getting coordination across that. And secondly, getting the basic funds that are needed to switch on a new development area, because you're starting with greenfield areas, you're starting with no infrastructure whatsoever.
Thank you. And my time is probably finished. Is it, Jason? Okay, I'll ask another question until he stops me.
Yes, Julie, you've got 1 minute. Sorry.
Including affordable by design principles in new growth area. Can you talk briefly about that?
The basic requirements around that is to look at what types of housing forms might be provided in the future to deliver housing for the different household formations that we're seeing. Typically, what we see delivered in an area is typically 4-bedroom homes. We know that the number of bedrooms has increased. We know that the household occupancy is going down, and we know that the nuclear family of mum, dad and 2 kids won't be the majority household in the future. So we're looking at household designs around dual occupancies, to open up different types of development in those areas. So it's about different housing choices and different housing forms.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you, Julie. Can I call the member for Longman, Terry?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. It's quite interesting, the Caboolture West development that you speak about is in my electorate of Longman, so I'm acutely aware. And can I just make the comment that despite the things that you've said today, that when I speak to the developers, one in particular would be North Harbour, their frustration with getting the land out and available lies fairly and squarely with the state government. That's their words, not mine. They're saying the council is very on board and very much willing to get things going. Apparently the council's had to really push the state government to make sure that everything was in place so that developers could be approached for the bypass, the Western bypass, to go from Caboolture down through to Narangba, and they said it was like pulling teeth. Now, the other thing I'd like to ask about is, and I don't know if this falls in your gambit as well, is that we talk about affordable housing. Well, the shortage of public housing is another issue in Queensland, and it's my understanding, I'd like to know whether this is true or not, is that in the last 8 years, the Queensland State Government has actually sold off 3,500 public houses, which is only exacerbating the problem.
Thank you. I'll answer the question about the North Harbour development area. The North Harbour development area is partially within the urban footprint and partially outside the urban footprint. Another part of our department, Economic Development Queensland, are currently in the stages of preparing what's called a priority development area, which is a planning scheme which will cover off on that site, and that is underway at the present time. But that is a greenfield area. It is not supplied with sufficient infrastructure, and getting those matters sorted and coordinated. I'll pass it to my colleague from Communities and Housing to speak on public housing issues.
Hi, Mark Moore. So between 2012 and 13 to 2021, 2,407 properties were sold. But they are in the context, we need to talk about the history of social housing since the 50s, where large land escapes were being built. Developments were completed over many years across parts of Queensland, and the continualness of being able to rejuvenate stock, to be able to put new accommodation that meets new building requirements in for people, to be able to put new housing on for Queenslanders, and all the money that gets sold goes back into reinvestment for new capital works. So year on year, there's still an increase in the total level of social housing in the Queensland environment, and it's around about 0.25% of total housing stock that's sold in any 1 year. Many of those are in housing estates where, that was said, were built many years in the past. The houses got old, and in some parts are in country towns, and the average sale price is generally less than 300,000 on some of those older stocks. So inherently, in a country town where many councils are asking for accommodation, they're being able to be purchased and be for use for affordable supply within those local townships.
So are we able to get on notice the figures for Queensland housing for the last 8 years, public housing sent to us? That would be very helpful. That'd be great. So just on North Harbour, if I may, Chair, just 1 minute. I've got hands-on experience with this. So the developer came to us and there was an issue with the EPBC approval, which had been done some time ago, and they had a change of development. So they came through federally to us to get the new design approved federally, which we said shouldn't be a problem. It was down with us. Now, when the state member, Chris Whiting, rang me a couple of weeks ago, he said, mate, I've just been on to our department here, and he said, we're not progressing with this because we're waiting for you guys to approve. Now, in speaking to our environmental department, they said that that's a load of rubbish. It's an excuse not to go ahead with it because they do their checks and balances concurrently all the time. So the developer is so frustrated because he's now saying that they're going to wait for our EPBC approval, which will probably come through in January, before they start doing the state process, which will prolong the process even further. Whereas if they are running it concurrently with us now, then in theory they should be approved about the same time and you can get on with it. So it's a difference between being able to turn dirt early next year or middle of next year.
Gentlemen, I'm sorry, lady and gentlemen, I'll need to ask you to take that on notice as Mr. Young's time has run out. I now call, I believe, was it Jed I was going to call or Matt? Sorry. Yep. Jed, thank you, Jed.
I'm happy to go ahead. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Chair. It's great to hear your my colleague, Mr. Young, in support of public housing. I really look forward to hearing that as a policy. We all love public housing. Now, thank you for your submission. My question is to the Department of State Development, Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning folk. You're very clear in your submission that simply upzoning areas is you don't feel is necessarily the answer, and that there are often poor outcomes that happen when zoning changes are championed or pushed through quickly. I'm interested in what those poor outcomes might be when your experience. I think you say there are many examples of areas where a lack of planning and failure to supply supporting infrastructure have resulted in poor outcomes. That's one thing I'm interested in. What are some of those poor outcomes? And Chair, my second question, and I will leave it at this. What role do you think the federal government has in supporting funding options for local government infrastructure that is necessary for development? You mentioned no interest loans from the state government. Do you think there is anything that the federal government can help LGAs with in terms of infrastructure costs and perhaps speeding up some of these delays?
Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, sorry, you have till 11:25 to answer that question. 3 minutes.
Okay. In terms of the first question about poor outcomes occurring, there are plenty of examples where an area has just been opened up for residential development and appropriate planning for services has not occurred at the same time. There is plenty of evidence that shows if you have that lack of services to service that local population, you get poor outcomes. Also the same with transport. If transport isn't extended, public transport isn't extended into an area, people will use cars first up, and getting them to change into public transport later on is a very difficult thing to do. The Caboolture West area, we're doing coordinated planning for that area. The 70,000 people you require in the order of 9 primary schools and 4 to 5 new high schools. You require planning for transport, for emergency services and other matters. So it's really important to get those things right. The second question about opportunities for additional funding. I note the NIFIC has a fund which is set aside to assist local governments and others with funding prospects. I understand that fund is quite considerable, but the calls on that haven't been made. So there's still quite a bit of funding there. One would ask whether the terms of NIFIC might be looked at to make that fund more attractive for others to use.
Thank you very much. Jed, you have time for another question because Queensland Government is so efficient in their answers.
Oh, now you've caught me on the hop. Okay. This might be a longer question. Your submission notes that many of the performance, I'm just looking at your submission here, the performance indicators under the NHHA are outside the control of states and territories and outside the scope of the NHHA. That's something that I'm interested in. Maybe you could elaborate on that. And Jason, this might be a longer question, so I'm happy for it to be put on notice. Because I'm interested in the operation of the NHHA in particular. How would you describe the state of the objectives of it currently? And can you explain this in regards of funding both from the state and federal governments? So, Jason, that might go on notice, as I probably used up my whole time actually asking the question.
Do you want to try and begin to answer that? And if you want to add to it as a question on notice, that would be perfectly acceptable.
Thank you, Chair. I'm actually not able to find that reference in our submission at the present time, so I would have to take that on notice.
No problem. Thank you very much. Jed, that's 11:25, so thank you. I believe, Bert, you have 5 minutes till 11:30, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your opening remarks. As somebody who represents an electorate that is one of the fastest growing in the country, has significant ongoing development and also is closely located with 2 PDA areas in Yarrabilba and Flagstone, I'm very interested in some of your comments because particularly around provision of infrastructure and services, but more importantly, and you referenced this, I think, in your opening remarks, that approved lot supply's fallen behind your own 4-year benchmark, particularly in Brisbane, Moreton Bay, Redland, Sunshine Coast and Gold Coast. And Gold Coast, for example, sits at 1.7 years. Interestingly, I note Logan isn't in that list, and given the development going on in Logan, I'm not surprised. What are you doing to identify those issues and help rectify that and achieve that 4-year benchmark?
Thank you for the question. First of all, I would note that the 4-year benchmark is an average across all local governments in South East Queensland, and we are actually meeting that target. It is in those individual local government areas where, particularly the coastal environments, where we are seeing that drop below that average. In terms of what we're doing, we're holding discussions with each local government area as to areas we might target and as to projects we might work on in collaboration with them. the Queensland State Government also had the $200 million Building Acceleration Fund and has been providing that funding to various local government areas, Moreton Bay, Redland, City Council and other areas. We're also looking at existing approvals in areas such as the Gold Coast to see if there are amendments that might be made to those approvals to get additional lot supply out of those areas. As an example, one recent proposal, we've worked with both the council and with the applicant potentially to get an additional 300 lots out of their development area, but still consistent with the infrastructure that they have provided.
So can I ask you a follow-up question to that? One of the issues that I see, and I've spoken with the member for Longman in regard to this around Caboolture West, because I've seen firsthand the failures of the lack of provision of infrastructure, services, public transport in particular to places like Yarrabilba, Flagstone, the lack of working opportunities that are located within those PDA areas because they're so disconnected from everything else in the city of Logan, let alone their surrounding areas. What is being done to mitigate those impacts on big new developments like Caboolture West? Because I know from the research that I've done, limited as it may be, there appears to be no provision for a heavy rail corridor into Caboolture West, or at least some sort of light rail connection back to the heavy rail that presently runs through Caboolture. We have no heavy rail facility from Flagstone into Brisbane, despite that going to have close to 200,000 people at completion development, equally for Yarrabilba. So what work is being done so that the mistakes that have been made with Yarrabilba and Flagstone and potentially Aura on the Sunshine Coast are not going to be repeated at Caboolture West?
Okay, so as an example, again, Caboolture West, we have recently approved a planning scheme amendment for that area for the Neighbourhood Development Plan 1 area. As part of doing the state interest checks on that area, we worked with Transport and Main Roads to look at transport solutions for that site. We also identified a site for a public school. We also looked at the capacity of hospital services in the area. And we're now doing master planning for the broader area of Caboolture West. Part of that hinges off identifying a new Western Arterial Road corridor as an alternative to the Bruce Highway at the present time. And as we work through our master planning for that area, we are working with Transport and Main Roads and Moreton Bay Regional Council to identify what transport will be required and where that will work. In terms of the use of heavy rail in that area, it will be more about linkages to existing stations into that area.
Thank you.
Time's up. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, but can I please call the member for Kingston Smith?
Thanks, Jason, and thank you for your evidence. One of the major terms of reference of this inquiry is to look at the impact of taxes and charges on housing supply. Some of the other submitters have pointed out that stamp duty, or transfer duty as it's known in Queensland, is an inhibitor to housing supply. And one of the more innovative submissions has been that we should be indexing the rates of transfer duties. I'm just wondering if the Queensland government does index the dutiable value of transfer duties, and if you don't, why not?
Thank you for the question. I'm afraid that I'm unable to answer that, and we would have to take that on notice.
Really?
I'm certainly not an expert on stamp duty.
Okay.
Matt, do you have any other questions? Because we can go to
I do. Could you also then take on notice if the Queensland government would consider looking at the transfer duty rates and making sure that they are indexed.
Certainly, we can take
Okay.
that.
Now, the other question I have is about, you mentioned in your submission, the build to rent project. It's a pilot project. Can you explain how that works and whether or not it's being looked at as a policy to roll out full time?
Mark Hall here. So the build to rent project is a project to establish a level of at market or subsidy to market for rental supply, for market rental supply. A number of projects, there's 2 projects that we approved. The state in putting out its requirement for that makes out a level of subsidy. A number of properties inside that development. The development is kept basically as a rental income or rental units. And then from that, the state will have a subsidy for review. Those could be allowed for people who have an eligibility criteria. Live in place, live close to where jobs are, and therefore not being able to be displaced if they should lose them. Few projects on the go, and we're currently state-owned site and for an additional site.
Thanks. Unfortunately, I couldn't hear any of that, but I'll read the transcript. I'm okay, Jason. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. James, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. You can hear me?
James, you've got till 38 past, so.
Not my time, I assume. Can I just ask a couple of questions about infrastructure costs and apportionment? I'm assuming when you talk about the cost of infrastructure augmentation, when it comes to infrastructure that's got a cash flow against it, like transmission lines and water and sewerage, those are regulated assets. At least I know it varies depending on your jurisdiction. Queensland still own your poles and wires, but what expectation do you put on developers to pay for infrastructure that's got a future cash flow associated with it, like electricity and water and sewerage?
In terms of electricity, that's not included in infrastructure charging. That's a matter for private agreement with the electricity providers. In terms of other utilities such as sewer, where a developer may be providing more capacity than their development allows for, there is the opportunity for the additional cost to be offset against their infrastructure charges. So, and that comes down to an agreement between the developer and, in Southeast Queensland, between the utility providers for water and sewer to about the terms of that payment and repayment terms over time. In some cases, it might mean that their infrastructure charges are reduced considerably. In other cases, it might mean there's a reduction and there's a need for a monetary payment back to the developer over time.
And so the infrastructure charges you put in place on a new development, apart from water, what sort of, I mean, are we talking, you know, the obvious being what? Road infrastructure, what sort of other stuff do you define as being captured within the need for those charges?
Okay, so for trunk infrastructure charges, we look at 5 major networks: water, sewer, transport, community land, which includes parkland and land for other community facilities, and water and drainage. So we have those 5 core networks which are planned for a new growth area and for which charges are set against. Now, our charging framework is a regulated charge, and for an average dwelling, that is about $31,000, which is, in some cases in Queensland, that applies across Queensland. That will certainly cover the cost of provision of that infrastructure, but in other parts, particularly in the southeast corner, there is a subsidy from the local government or from some other funding source.
What sort of block size is that? Sorry, just so I...
Look, the average block size in southeast Queensland, I think, is sitting between 500 and 600 square metres at the present time. We are seeing a trend to smaller lot sizes over time.
And what's the principle of the subsidy from local government? I assume it's worth their while to help get more blocks into the market for their future rateable.
Certainly, local governments are keen to see the areas they've identified for growth to get across the line. In some cases, they think that subsidy is an appropriate way of funding those areas.
And apologies if you can't answer this, but do you know if that happens outside of Queensland, where local government, I suppose, you know, that's an example of them being quite proactive and encouraging land release and land development if they're prepared to put financial support into that. Do you know of any other states or jurisdictions that do something like that?
No, I'm sorry, I couldn't answer that question at the present time. I don't have an up-to-date summary of other jurisdictions.
And
Okay, thank you, Mr. Stevens, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And I do appreciate the Queensland Government for at least having the courage to front this inquiry. Thank you for your participation today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, please forward it to the Secretariat by the 22nd of November 2021. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and will have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. Thank you very much. Could I now please invite witnesses from the Karratha and Districts Chamber of Commerce and Industry and the Pilbara Full Purpose Organisation. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
So Brendan Grills here, representing the Karratha District Chamber of Commerce with two other colleagues. I'll let them introduce themselves.
Jordan Ralph, representing the Karratha Chamber of Commerce.
And Tanya Dodd, KDCCI.
Tanya, you're just outside camera range, which, if that's how you want it, that's fine. If that's not
okay,
I should warn you. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
my name is Sylvia Winkler, and I'm the Treasurer for Pilbara for Purpose, which is a peak organisation for the for-purpose social services sector.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. This hearing is a legal proceeding in the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. It is important to note that although your evidence is protected by parliamentary privilege, this protection cannot be enforced outside Australia. Can I now invite each organisation to make a short opening statement before we proceed to questions?
Thank you, Chair Falinsky. On behalf of the Karratha District Chamber of Commerce, we welcome the opportunity to present to the inquiry. We've been working on an innovative tax reform proposal in and around housing in mining communities. I think everyone on the committee hearing today would recognise that the boom and bust cycles in mining communities is very pronounced. We went through a substantial one here in the Pilbara between 2010 and 2014. Median rentals pushing up to $1,500 a week, which counts out the whole community apart from the mining sector and causes enormous pain. And then it's very hard for us to walk away from the downturn of that cycle, where the $1,500 a week rental dropped back to $300 a week, and the banks got very interested in those transactions and foreclosed on hundreds of properties across the Pilbara region. It's no different in the Queensland mining communities as well. For that reason, we've come together in a partnership across the local government areas of the 4 local governments of the Pilbara, which is Karratha, Port Hedland, East Pilbara and Ashburton, the Goldfields region, Kalgoorlie, Coolgardie, Leonora, but also interestingly partnering with Isaac Regional Council in Queensland, Mount Isa in Queensland and Broken Hill in New South Wales, all mining centres, looking at fringe benefits tax, how it impacts on housing in our communities, and rather than just pointing out the problems, I think probably for the first time proposing a solution. Everyone would know that fringe benefits tax is exempted 100% for companies that purchase houses, but individuals only get a 50% exemption. That's created the quite strange anomaly that the Productivity Commission in their 2020 findings found that there's 42,000 properties owned by companies, predominantly in these mining communities that are receiving 100% FBT exemption. Our policy reform, which we would like the consideration of this committee and in the lead up to the next federal election, is around extending that 100% FBT exemption to individuals to try and put the property challenge in the hand of people with a long-term vested interest in the community, as opposed to the company end, because company.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you there because we're very short on time. My apologies for that.
Thank you. That's our opening submission.
Ms. Winkler.
Thank you. So we are supporting the modern mining campaign that has been put forward by Brendan Grant and the various chambers. Our focus are the social services that currently are not being delivered. We commenced our advocacy efforts about 15 months ago when we could see that there was a housing crisis on the horizon. What we do see is not just housing affordability, but in certain areas housing availability, but also the shortage of short-term accommodation. What we are now seeing as an impact is the fact that essential services can't be delivered. For example, aged care facilities can't open, childcare can't staff their centres, there are long wait lists for workers, teachers are leaving, poor educational and health outcomes, especially for our children and in relation to the early intervention space. Furthermore, there's overcrowding, especially in Aboriginal communities, and much higher is the rate of domestic and family violence, and those people can't be serviced because positions are not being filled. So it's very much in a nutshell. A lot more detail has been provided in our submission. What we do see as a major contributing factor, other than the resource companies and the boom and bust cycle, is also the fact that a lot of housing is taken up by government agencies, and in conjunction with that, they have maintenance contractor model, where houses have been sitting empty for years and they're not getting repaired. So what we see as a solution is in the short term to put an exemption into place for the head maintenance contractor model to change and allow regional and local companies to conduct those repair works, because there are houses there, but they need to be looked at and repaired. And in the long term, in terms of affordability of housing, especially for non-government workers, to put allowances into funding contracts for remote regions such as the Pilbara, so that non-government workers are able to afford the house that they're supposed to live in to serve them.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Winkler. Can I start by asking, we'll start by thanking all of you for coming today. But in your submission, you say that within remote mining communities, a handful of communities bear the brunt of the housing supply shortages and poor affordability in both the rental and owner-occupier markets. Can you explain this more? And, because I only get one bite at the cherry, why are some mining communities affected? What factors are causing other communities to be less affected by housing supply shortages?
So I think we recognise that across the board there are housing problems. The challenge is that rents have never got to $3,000 a week in Sydney for a standard 4x2 property. This is our challenge. And so Karratha, population 25,000. We pride ourselves on big contribution to the nation's exports. But when major projects are reaching final investment decision, we get step changes in rent and property costs, which are astronomical. We've got Woodside proposing a major expansion, currently could make FID on about a $15 billion project before the end of the year. We know from not too distant history that probably sees rent demands go up very, very quickly, and rents which are currently sitting around $700 as a median, we expect to see them push above $1,000 a week very quickly after that. So it's this cycle of major company ownership in the town, limited owner occupiers, and major investment decisions, which cause short-term shortages. And then obviously at the end of that cycle, you get the letdown that comes post that. So the only solution to that is building the market to be bigger, more houses, more owner occupiers. But of course, you've got a market that's scared of these mining communities, be it Moranbah or Karratha or Newman. And so banks aren't that keen on the conversation. Individuals are scared of it. And so the cycle repeats itself. And for us to be back above $1,000 median rents again, so close to the last cycle in 2013-14, I think shows fundamental, policy failure. And that's why we're putting a solution on the table to try and have individuals build through the cycle. There's been no house built in Karratha in the last 5 years, just starting again now off this uptick. You can't outbuild the boom, so these houses won't be ready to take advantage of the market that's moving at the moment. And invariably, companies, governments, and individuals build to have a property ready at the end of the cycle rather than the start of the cycle when you need them.
I might just add in there, right? There is an extraordinarily large amount of pain that's borne by small business owners and individuals due to these cycles. So companies who can make big decisions, see their construction program through to completion and then finish. The people who ultimately hurt the most are the small businesses that have bought houses to house their own workers, and the individuals that have tried to invest in the community during that boom, only to be finding themselves in negative equity positions or being wound up afterwards. And that's what happened here and in other Pilbara communities in a big way about 10 years ago. And it's also happened in other places as well, which we're trying to stave off.
All right, I went way over time. Thank you very much for that. Julie, if you can keep it to 3 minutes, that'd be great, but you do technically have 5.
Oh, that's really hard. I think I love you guys. Around the world, all around the world at the moment, there's really sort of great academics and universities trying to work out how to make common good, how to bring common good back into communities where we've essentially killed it. And I read your submission and I get the impression that you guys had this remarkable number of answers for yourself, but there are barriers in the way to you implementing them. And I'm referring to refurbishing condemned houses and finding old mining camps, and looking at the complexity of how you keep health workers, etc. So could you tell me what the world would look like if you could actually do what you want to do?
So from our perspective, what the world would look like is simply a number of old houses that are unlivable at the moment. They would be livable again, therefore relieving some of the pressure. So where we really see the impact is, our schools are suffering, our children are suffering, and a lot of our DV and family violence victims are suffering. So we would see a bigger housing stock, but old houses livable, and therefore, some of the pressure just relieved. So that's the immediate impact. Long term, basically echoing what the Karratha Chamber has put forward, because a lot of those factors are at play. Obviously the fallout from that is impacting the social services sector, but it's basically in the short term, that would be the case, and it would be affordable for essential workers to live in.
What does pop-up housing look like?
So there are various ways of looking at it. So pop-up housing could be something like, putting a granny flat in unused lots for a period of time, or dongas that could be dismantled from some of the mining camps and putting them out, maybe just for 6 months, 12 months, as long as property owners who have not developed their vacant land are happy for it to be used that way.
Okay, but the sort of housing market which exists up there doesn't work in your system at all, does it?
No, not really. For one, because as Brandon has outlined, is that a large majority of the housing stock is owned by mining companies. And while in some areas they're very mindful of the essential services that need to be delivered, and they allocate a small percentage of housing to service providers, or that tend to go out the window when there's a boom and money to be made. So that is something we want to counteract and put something permanent in place that doesn't happen as much anymore. And yes, in certain areas, there's maybe a little bit more housing available, but it's unaffordable. Or in the inland Pilbara, that's where some of the towns are simply landlocked. So where there's, native title agreements at play, state government won't release lots, and mining companies are not willing to spend the money on making those lots usable, I suppose.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you. Could I go to Bert, because I don't think Terry's still with us?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for your opening remarks and for your submissions. And I find the discussion particularly interesting, given some of the testimony we also had last week about affordability of rents in remote communities. I suspect, looking at the level of rents, it's an attractive investment proposition, and people probably don't reinvest a lot back into their properties either. So you note in your submission that you support two suggestions made by the More Than Mining campaign. Can you please explain how those suggestions would address the housing crisis in your communities and maybe other remote communities as well?
So I'll have a start of that, and Sylvia can come in. At the end of the day, we've got market failure. As I said, very large proportion of company-owned houses, investors who are very interested in the market on the upside, very disinterested on the downside, and the banks now have got big red flags against mining communities right across the nation. So it's very, very hard to actually get a loan to build. And so then we sort of lurch from one crisis to the next. There's a perception that everyone living in a mining community gets a big wage. So yes, houses are more expensive, so you'll be okay. But communities are made up of more than just other people that work in mining jobs. They're made up of, shop owners, small business owners, service workers, the person that pulls the beer and makes the coffee. They're still on $80,000 in these communities, and their rent is the equivalent of their wage, which means they're sharing a house, living in a caravan, living 10 to a property, or leaving. And so what we've called for is the 100% FBT exemption, which is afforded to companies as a full tax deduction to provide housing to their staff in specific mining communities where the banks have said red flag, where individuals are understandably nervous about investing. If they could invest in owner-occupied properties pre-tax, before tax is taken out, improves their purchasing power, and also gives them some comfort in the cycle that when the property prices come down off the back of the commodity price cycle and the construction cycles, that they're not underwater and not being foreclosed on by the banks. If we don't break that nexus, we'll go to the next cycle in 5-6 years' time with exactly the same problem we've got now, which is exactly the same problem we had in 2010, 2011, 2012.
The nutshell is an economic reason for an individual to invest in housing throughout the cycle, rather than just in the concentrated periods at which there's a peak.
So the next question is, what is actually the quality, given that you made in your opening remarks, you said there hasn't been a house built in Karratha in 5 years. What is the quality of the housing stock that is actually available either for rent or for purchase?
No, so we built a lot of houses from 2010 to 2014. So they're all new. So there's whole new suburbs of, the school that my boys go to school to have got 800 kids in it, in a new suburb that didn't exist prior to 2008. So that's an example of what happens during the boom. But all of those properties probably went into negative equity from 2014 to 2017. And then you've got the remnants of the previous cycle. So back in the 70s, there was a whole bunch of 3x1 houses built, which are sort of older stock now. But the City Council here has been positive. They've rezoned all that to try and facilitate upgrades. but it all gets back to the banks being willing to lend against properties in this part of the world and in mining communities across the nation. And banks are very, very wary of that. And that makes it very difficult for any renewal or any individual to want to make that decision. And even if you could get the banks to say yes, normally someone knows someone that did their shirt in a mining community property cycle. And so they try and talk you out of it if the bank hasn't already done it.
Okay, I'm sorry, Bert, I'm going to have to stop you there. I think we're up to Jed.
Hi, thanks, Chair. Thank you. I'm just going to carry on a bit from Bert's line of questioning because I think it's great that you've come with this idea. Have you flagged this with the banks? Like, are you certain that this would make a game changer for the banks who are unwilling to give loans? And do you think it's enough to allow the smoothing out of the boom and bust cycle for property owners? You're confident of that?
It's one part of an overall mix. I don't think it's going to be the silver bullet. Our Pilbara Development Commission has been engaging with the Australian Banking Association for a couple of years now, putting forward data that says that this market is more stable than what they say it is. Banks frequently rely on what they call, volatile data to support their tougher policies in these parts. That has basically had no impact over a couple of years of lobbying. This comes down to the way the individual is assessed at the bank level, and greater purchasing power gives them the ability to pass that bank test more easily. However, there are still going to be policies that remain around loan to value ratios or just the choice to participate at all, which won't move initially. However, we expect that if we do show over time a smoothing of the cycle, the lenders will participate.
This is a substantial individual benefit. As I said, if you look at a person on $140,000 buying a $650,000 property, which is about the cost of building a new standard 4x2 in the Pilbara, $140,000 is about the median income of a mine worker here. Obviously, some people higher, some people lower in the service worker sector. But the benefit to them of 100% FBT exemption would average out over the life of a mortgage at around $15,000 a year. A bigger advantage up front, about $40,000 here at the beginning, and about $15,000 as an average. So it's a substantial benefit to try and break the cycle that has been such a negative influence on mining communities for a number of years now.
Thank you, Chair. Can I ask that could you send us that modelling that you just said?
Yes, we've got a More Than Mining website. It's got calculators, all this information, but we'll put together a package for your committee as well that explains the ins and outs. Quite technical, which is why it's a challenge and why I think this really hasn't been pursued previously, because it's hard to stand up in a room of people and explain to them the intricacies of fringe benefits taxes and how they work between companies and individuals.
Sure, I get that. Hence, I'm asking the question. So sorry. So that would be very helpful for this committee if you could provide us with that. I'm particularly interested in how it would smooth out the peaks and troughs for investors and give them more confidence. Thank you.
Are you finished yet?
I'm finished, Chair. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we're over to James Stevens. James?
Sorry, I just had an issue with my mute. Could I just dig into, in your submission, you talked about the need to have some timely investment in the supply chain throughout all stages of the resources investment cycle. So you're sort of saying, I suppose, effectively, investment in housing is, not surprisingly linked to the boom bust of the resources cycle. So how would you, what does that look like, and what are you recommending is the solution to that problem?
So as I said, that we have peaks and troughs in demand off the back of the commodity cycle. We built, probably 1,500 properties, I think, from memory in Karratha off the back of the last cycle, 2010 to 2014, and then none for the last 5 years. That market is just starting to move again. But what you find then is that everyone wants to build a house at the same time that companies are trying to construct multi-billion-dollar projects. So not surprisingly, the houses become expensive because you can't get the people to do it. And so we believe that FBT reform would encourage at the bottom of the cycle, because at that point you would be making the decision that do I want to salary sacrifice to my mortgage, or am I happy to send the tax to the taxman as opposed to put it into my mortgage? So we think that's an encouragement to build what we would say against the cycle. When the market is slow, when the builders are available, actually be building in these mining communities at that stage rather than at the moment, because we're about to move into another crisis situation. Sylvia's right that we're going to need emergency measures to help out service workers and not-for-profits and the like, but they're going to be competing against Woodside's demand for a $12 billion project here in the Pilbara. And so we don't win that outcome. Government and companies do a little bit, but never enough. And then it stops, waiting for the next cycle to start. And I'd really impress on you that you can't outbuild a boom. The boom arrives before we can keep up with housing. And so if we don't have this problem solved in the bottom of the cycle, we're not going to solve it in the top of the cycle.
So what are the opportunities to work with the companies on that? I mean, surely on the balance of it all, they want to see that smoothing too, and that housing shortages impact on their cost of these major projects. I mean, are there and have you explored the opportunities with them to cooperate on what you're proposing, apart from your advocated tax changes? I mean, you still got to understand how the cycle's moving and get the best read from them and support from them to be spreading resources, I assume.
Well, the response to this has been FIFO. Because you can't get housing and it's so expensive, the response becomes FIFO. And as the market goes up, the companies will start flying up their security staff, their kitchen staff, their gardening staff, and so the depth of FIFO reaches further into the community to try and manage. So yes, we would dearly like the companies to build more houses, but I don't think that's a long-term sustainable solution to normalising a community that just wants to be who we are and be proud of what we produce and what we create. It's hard to do that when rents go above $1,000 a week and all the people that Sylvia represents become collateral damage of a mining expansion, which is good for the state, good for the nation, delivers lots of revenue to the bottom line of all government jurisdictions. But the collateral damage is the people in these communities that can't afford to keep up with the cycle and have to wear the pain. And again, the foreclosures and the like that we have has now sort of marked our card, I suppose. And so without some sort of change to try and turn that around, it also makes innovation and the new economy. We've got a big push on hydrogen here in the Pilbara at the moment, but innovators in the hydrogen space would look at what's happening with our housing market at the moment and suggest that they probably would do it somewhere else. Andrew Forrest made the decision to go to Gladstone last week, which I don't know if that's going to save his housing, but that all sort of piles on top of it, and we become, I suppose, as a local community, the collateral damage of an outcome that's benefiting the nation.
And
Thank
so,
you.
Based on that, what Brendan just explained, so yes, P4P has tried working with the big mining companies, with the private sector as well, to find solutions, and those conversations are ongoing. Depending on where in the Pilbara you're based, those solutions are easier to find for some areas than in others. So in the Pilbara, what we're finding is some of the towns are landlocked, so there's Crown land, native title agreements are in place. There simply isn't much there to be released, and there's also, I suppose, a level of unwillingness from some of the mining companies to spend big amounts of money to develop that, because they're expecting, obviously, for the economic cycle to take place, and then what's going to happen in 3 or 4 years' time. That's the argument when, we are in another downturn and then we've got all that excess housing. So that is what we are up against in our advocacy efforts time and again. And that is very similar to what we hear from state governments.
Thank you very much, and thank you, James. Matt, you actually have more than 5 minutes if you would like to take it.
There you go. Thanks. Thanks for your submission. I'm interested in your proposal for a fringe benefits tax exemption for rent. When I read it, I got the impression that this is something that would be an advantage for the company and for managers, but I'm not so sure it'd advantage workers. Can you give us any confidence that workers would benefit from this as well as managers and the companies?
So the main driver of this is that, as I said, that nothing that we do now will have an influence over the next 12 to 24 to 36 months. The cycle has already arrived on us. And so if I can give you an example, I've got 3 boys. We've got a Football West soccer coach who is a resident in town. He doesn't get a housing allowance. He rents privately in the market. If his rent goes to $600 a week, he can't afford to stay anymore. He needs to leave. If he could salary sacrifice to that rent, his marginal tax rate is his discount on that rent. So essentially his purchasing power of his $80,000 increases if he could salary sacrifice to his rent. Most of the companies are well positioned in this, and as I said, a company can rent a house in pre-tax dollars, so essentially salary sacrifice anyway. And you've picked on what I say is the biggest problem, that in a cycle, I've got my soccer coach, his house is up for releasing, so his term has come to an end. He's standing at the counter of the real estate agent. Woodside has just made a $12 billion investment decision. Their contractors also need houses for their workforce. That contractor can rent that house in pre-tax dollars as a business expense. The football coach earning $80,000 a year can't. And at that moment, they're at the real estate counter bidding for the same house. One person with pre-tax dollars, one person with after-tax dollars, the after-tax dollars being the community worker, the football coach, the business and the contractor being the one doing it in pre-tax dollars. So you've just summed up the whole fundamental of why we've got FBT reform on the table, because at that particular moment, you've got a very big disparity between a service worker in the community and a worker coming to work on a $12 billion project, which is good for the state and good for the nation.
At the moment, what proportion of company-owned or company-rented housing would be going to managers compared to the average worker?
Well, as I said, most companies own a proportion of housing, and then their contractors are the ones that rent in the private market. So I think between Woodside and Rio Tinto and Yarra in Karratha, there's about 8,000, is that right? 8,000 properties, I think it is, in our region owned by companies, and it, there's still a number of owner occupiers, but the percentage as compared to every other region is substantially lower for owner occupiers. And then you've got the service workers represented by Sylvia, who's been talking about today, trying to find a spot in that rental market. But as we move into this cycle, as I said, you've hit the nail on the head of the problem. I've got someone with a tax advantage to secure a property competing against someone without a tax advantage, and the people without the tax advantage are the ones that we say are critical to the social fabric of our community.
That could be something we can get you. I mean, the City of Karratha do have those numbers precisely. And it'd be pretty similar to, Port Hedland, Shire of Ashburton, and other Western Australian mining communities as well. Over in Moranbah and Broken Hill, the mix would be different. But I guess essentially what you're talking about, there's a higher proportion than any other place of company-owned or leased houses.
But I imagine most of those houses would be going to middle to senior managers, wouldn't they? I mean, that'd be part of the deal to attract them to go there.
So a company like Yarra Pilbara, which has got the ammonium nitrate manufacturing plant, which supplies the mining industry, they supply a house to every one of their workers. Woodside supplies a house to every one of their workers. So whether you're an operator on 180,000 or senior manager, they all have company houses. That's why the numbers are so big. And as I mentioned at the beginning, that the Productivity Commission said there's 42,000 company-owned homes receiving the 100% FBT exemption, predominantly in the Pilbara, the Bowen Basin and the Central Highlands of Queensland.
Okay, thanks. That's it for me, Jason.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I have a number of questions which I'll place on notice, but I do thank you for taking the time and your participation today. It's very much appreciated. If you could answer any questions that you took on notice or any questions that are asked on notice by the 22nd of November, that would be greatly appreciated. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and will have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. I'd now like to call representatives from the Townsville City Council, Snowy Monaro Regional Council, Regional Australia Institute, and the Australian Local Government Association. Would you please, for the Hansard record, please state your name and capacity in which you appear before the committee. If we could start with Townsville City Council, please.
Thank you. Jenny Hill, Mayor of Townsville City Council.
Thank you, Jenny. The Snowy Monaro Regional Council.
Yes, good afternoon. Peter Bascom, Chief Executive Officer.
Thank you, Peter. Regional Australia Institute. Thank you. The Australian Local Government Association.
Hello, Councillor Linda Scott, the President of the Australian Local Government Association.
Thank you very much. Could I please invite each of you, this hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. It is important to note that although your evidence is protected by parliamentary privilege, this protection cannot be enforced outside Australia.
Confused what you've done here.
Jed, you've gone off mute. Sorry.
Sorry, everyone. I'm just sorting through all the submissions, the wonderful submissions here. Sorry.
No problem. I would like to now invite the three representatives that we have to make a short opening statement before we proceed to questions. Could I please call Townsville City Council, Mayor Jenny Hill.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to the Chair and honourable members. I'm sure you've seen our written submission. I will touch on elements of that in my opening remarks, but we wish to share with you the concerns that have been raised by me and through residents, construction companies and members of the property development sector more broadly. By way of background, Townsville is a city of approximately 200,000 people and growing quickly. Many people from southern states fleeing the pandemic and associated lockdowns are coming to the north, seeking relative freedoms, lifestyle, and of course, better weather. We have a dynamic development sector in North Queensland with a proud history. However, in recent times, difficulties with overheads, labour market and supply chains concerns have put hurdles in the way of their business. Their growth, the growth of our housing stock and the affordability for renters and home buyers in the region. By and large, housing in North Queensland consists of detached homes. While many people enjoy this way of living, with more and more people coming from larger cities who are used to apartment living, there is a strong demand for units in North Queensland. However, existing and new apartment stock in the region is difficult to construct and or sell due to high body corporate fees caused by exponentially increasing strata insurance premiums. The federal government's announcement on the reinsurance pool was welcomed by all of us, but significant concerns remain about the lack of scope to address strata insurance costs in Northern Australia. This is one of the biggest affordability challenges for those wishing to live in units and apartments in the north. Some locally based developers have also advised me that contractors' insurance is also a challenge for the property sector, again outside the scope of the consultations for the reinsurance pool. The ongoing affordability of housing in North Queensland is an ongoing concern. While property values are lower in the north than in southeast of the state, insurance premiums for building and contents in the region are much, much higher. More recently, the property sector locally has advised of sector-wide difficulties of acquiring sufficiently skilled labour to keep up with demand, as well as a shortage of supply materials. Costs of subcontracting services like fencing, concreting, plumbing have all skyrocketed during the COVID periods, with some prices for services locally up by 400% since the beginning of 2020. And we believe these supply chains will be made much harder by the increasing push in the southeast corner, particularly around major projects like the Olympics. Thank you again for the time to present to the committee and allowing me to make these short opening remarks. And I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Your Worship. Could I ask Mr. Peter Boscombe from Snowy-Monaro Regional Council to give a short opening statement?
Thank you for the opportunity to address you this afternoon. I'd like to begin my statements by asking the committee to remember that there are many factors which promote or impede responsive housing supply besides the state and local government planning systems. As stated in the New South Regional Housing Task Force findings report, housing outcomes are driven by various demand side and supply side factors, including the planning system, land availability, as well as taxation, interest rates and finance regulation. And faster rezoning approvals won't solve the problem alone, in that industry, councils and government need to work together to turn approvals into completions. At the moment, it's an exciting time to be living in and working in the Snowy-Monaro region, but it does come with some downsides as well. Our region's median house price sale in March 2020 was $350,000. And in the 12 months to March 2021, it had risen to $460,000, experiencing a 31% growth. In contrast, the weighted average of 8 capital cities for the same period was only 16.8%. Council has observed a similar growth in rental markets. From data for the 12 months to June 2021, Snowy-Monaro was identified as having the highest year-on-year change increase in rent, up by 28.6%. This is greater than the 16.4% experienced in other regional lifestyle markets such as Byron, Coffs Harbour. It's also an excessive growth rate compared to the national capital city year-on-year percentage increase of 5.9%. In a regional setting where our average household income is nearly half that of the national average, such high annualised growth in median house and rental prices is unsustainable and will create additional social and economic challenges for the region in the short to medium term. The immediate challenge to the housing crisis is little to no skilled and essential workforce migration into the region, resulting in the apparent opportunities associated with the regionalisation agenda and the Snowy 2 project being missed. It's apparent that the current mix of taxation, financial and other incentives and regulation across the 3 tiers of government is not driving the market to deliver the housing that regional Australia desperately needs. State and local government planning systems continue to undergo reform with the aim of reducing red tape. Snowy-Monaro itself has discounted its developer contributions in the hope it will encourage the development of approved subdivisions. And Council has, over the recent years, approved over 200 lots in subdivisions which have yet to be developed. And there is the capacity in appropriately zoned residential land for 6,348 additional dwellings across our region, well in excess of our estimated demand over the next 20 years of around 3,000 additional dwellings.
Thank you, Mr. Boscombe. I believe we now have Dr. Kim Horton from the Regional Australia Institute. Kim, you may need to introduce yourself just for the purposes of Hansard.
Thank you, Chair. Kim Horton, I'm the Chief Economist at the Regional Australia Institute, and I'll take this opportunity to make a short opening statement.
The shorter the better, Dr. Horton.
Okay, thank you. So I can hear from the, you've probably heard many of these issues well expounded, the rapid growth in house prices is causing a lot of trouble in regions, particularly for places where there's no accommodation for the workers that they need. We've seen a very significant increase in job vacancies and needs for workers in regional Australia, and many regions are telling us that the housing shortage is compromising their ability to grow. I'll just cover off on a couple of the drivers and a couple of the responses. It's not just about population movement. There's been some conjecture that it's people flooding out of the cities from COVID. Our regional movers index shows that it's not just people leaving the cities that's driving this regional population growth. It's actually more people staying in regions. So fewer people are leaving regions to go back to the cities, that normal cycle that they do. That means they're not vacating their properties for housing or for rent. So that's really adding to this particular pinch point. The desirability of regions is only going to increase with work from home. Some survey work that we did late last year showed that 1 in 5 capital city residents is looking to make a regional move in the next 2 to 3 years. So it's very encouraging to see this big jump in dwelling approvals for regions. But when we look at that data more closely, we can see that as in previous jumps in dwelling approvals, it's really tightly tied to the home builder process. So when that finished in March, these dwelling approvals have dropped. So there's some underlying challenges there that need to be addressed. And there are two types of regions, two types of challenges. One is, and I think some of the panellists have already commented on this, many regions do have long-term supply, which is within the bounds of what their population growth can be. But the market failure seems to be around getting those dwellings on site quickly and getting the right mix of dwellings and getting some of those dwellings to be lower cost dwellings. There's a significant undersupply, the missing middle of medium density in regional Australia. We've just finished a long study in Western Queensland, quite remote areas. Demand there is split really evenly between detached dwellings and houses and units and apartments, and that's even quite small places of around 1,000 or 2,000 people. So there's some market failure there around getting the development sector. I think the structures and the incentives aren't right yet for the development sector to really take advantage of those medium density prospects in regions. Medium density in regions, even in our smaller centres, will bring that price point down and will start to slow those growth rates. Regions have always been popular, and regional population growth can help divert Australia from its long-term trajectory, which is a somewhat troubling one, of 2 mega cities of about 10 million and then two other cities of around 5 million, with most of the projected growth being for the outer suburbs of those capital cities. A process of regionalisation can help rebalance that growth, can promote the benefits and resource the benefits of living and working regionally, can change this trajectory and bring with it significant improvements in overall housing market performance, affordability, availability and lifestyle satisfaction. One of the key issues that we find in our more inland places are our smaller markets, so not the high growth population centres, but the ones inland. Those markets are stalled because of the combination of banks being requiring quite large deposits because there's very few transactions for them to base their market valuations on. Couple that with the build costs being lower than build costs being much higher than the existing median house price. We think there are about a third of regional local government areas are in this situation where these markets have stalled. Our recommendation on that one is for a regional new home guarantee along the lines of what the federal government has been doing for first home buyers and for single parents in recent budgets that would help to bridge that equity gap that our regional purchasers are finding difficult to match. So there's a couple of solutions there for a couple of very different kinds of regional markets, and thanks to the committee for inviting us to contribute this time.
Thank you, Dr. Horton. Australian Local Government, Councillor Linda Scott, President. Thank you, Councillor.
Thanks so much, Chair and Committee, for your time today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging I'm here in Sydney, so pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and thank you for your time. Obviously, I'm speaking to you today as the President of the Australian Local Government Association, which represents the nation's 537 local governments through our 7 state and territory government associations. And I understand that later on today, you'll also be hearing from a number of our members, including the Municipal Association of Victoria and, of course, the Local Government Association of South Australia. Of course, I can hear already that you're hearing from people that the affordability of housing across the nation continues to be one of the greatest challenges that our communities are facing, and councils hear this on a regular basis. From a local government perspective directly, the cost and availability excuse me, of housing is one of the most pressing issues. I repeatedly hear from mayors across the nation about how the shortage of affordable housing is impacting their local economy and individuals and families in their community. And indeed, over the last months here in New South Wales, I've had regional mayors tell me for the first time they have people either at risk of or indeed actually sleeping rough in their communities. This is a new phenomenon in the lifetimes of many of our regional communities. We know that in some regional areas there is high growth and they're growing faster than anticipated due to recent changes in migration patterns. However, in other communities, there simply just isn't enough affordable housing for key workers. And of course, sadly, in others, due to high housing costs and increasing number of people sleeping rough. The high number of submissions in this inquiry from local governments shows that this is a major concern for all of us. At the Local Government Association of Queensland annual conference in Mackay only 2 weeks ago, for example, Queensland councils voted in support of a range of motions aimed at addressing housing accessibility and affordability. The LGAQ President and Sunshine Coast Mayor, Mark Jamieson, said the issue was not isolated to any one part of Queensland, as you've heard from the Mayor of Townsville today, and that councils and their communities across the state of Queensland are being impacted by housing affordability and diversity challenges. There are communities facing shortages, rapid price rises, and big dips in rental vacancy rates. The Flinders Shire Council have said that Queensland's rural housing crisis was threatening to derail initiatives rural and remote councils are putting in place to diversify their own economies and industries and to reverse population decline. And at our ALGA National Conference held in Canberra this year, attended by more than 700 local government leaders from across the nation, there were a range of motions related to the housing crisis, calling for greater investment in social and affordable housing and the need for a national housing strategy. While the provision of affordable housing is, of course, not just a local government responsibility, local governments often facilitate affordable housing within our communities, operating within state and territory planning, financial and other legislative requirements. The housing challenge is, of course, different in each community across Australia, and so each council's response is necessarily dependent on its own local scenario, as well as, of course, the financial resources and priorities of the council. But we know that all levels of government, the community and the private sector have a role to play. We acknowledge local governments have an important role to play in the complex housing supply and affordability issue. And this, of course, includes planning to ensure there's an appropriate supply and mix of housing to meet every community's diverse and changing needs. Many councils are working extremely hard and often on the ground doing all the heavy lifting. Cases, councils are also going above and beyond our legislated roles and responsibilities to directly deliver services that aren't being delivered by other tiers of government. Aged care, early education services, and indeed even the provision of affordable public housing. Responding to market failure, the Swan Hill Rural City Council in Victoria is undertaking an 8-block housing subdivision in Robbville to alleviate the shortages of housing in that area. There's no homes for workers in this community, itinerant farm workers, skilled farm workers and managers, and professionals like doctors and accountants. The council there is hoping to encourage a local building business to expand or bring a new builder to town, stimulating the local economy and encouraging others to develop. In my own state of New South Wales, the Tamworth Regional Council is supporting a Tamworth Regional Housing Forum to bring together stakeholders from across the sector to work on activating affordable housing. A recent report by the New South Wales Regional Housing Task Force shows the housing problem is complex and requires smart solutions, not blame games. Councils, sadly, are often the scapegoat for regional housing shortages, but this report found this was a huge oversimplification that should be rejected. Our firm view, backed up by overwhelming evidence, is that simply increasing housing supply does not lead to a reduction in the price of housing or indeed increase the amount of affordable housing. This is, of course, a multifactorial problem. Issues such as changes to recent migration patterns, cheap finance and labour and material shortages in the construction sector have all currently had an impact on the supply of housing. I know there's a lot of discussion as well about infrastructure contributions, and our view is that these are critical for supporting economic growth. Councils, of course, need to deliver quality infrastructure and open spaces if we are to attract people to buy the homes and make livable neighbourhoods, cities and towns as a result. Local governments have also been pleased to have supported numerous policy and government initiatives introduced by state and territory and the federal governments over the last few years, and we're active participants in these initiatives, often working collaboratively with those responsible in the private sector and not-for-profit to improve housing outcomes. But it is critical that we all see greater investment in social and affordable housing from federal and state governments to support community and private sector to do more. It's essential local governments be appropriately funded to support our communities. Collectively, we raise about 3.4% of Australia's total taxation revenue each year. Financial sustainability and revenue certainly would allow councils to better plan and develop infrastructure to meet growing community expectations. We're working very hard on behalf of the nation's councils to obtain a fairer share of Commonwealth taxation revenue, and to that end are advocating for at least a return of 1% of federal assistance grants from Commonwealth taxation revenue. These are critical streams of revenue to augment rate revenue and infrastructure contributions and allow us to address these future challenges. We know national housing and homelessness agreements are now determined between the federal and state governments without direct engagement from local governments. There are reasons. For this reason, we also support a considered national dialogue about housing affordability and settlement in Australia. For example, a national housing summit that develops a national housing strategy with input from local governments. Of course, there is no one-size-fits-all solution to the housing challenge, but on behalf of the nation's 537 councils, I think there is a stronger need for more local government voice in this discussion. It was disappointing to see that some of the dialogues that had been established under COAG have been disbanded since May 2020. And so restoring the role of local government in national decision making will of course also significantly support housing outcomes and demonstrate the federal government's leadership in this regard. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
On mute, Jason.
You'd think after 2 years, Bert, I would have worked this out. I'm going to give everyone 5 minutes, which means we'll probably end 4 minutes over. So apologies to those of you who've joined us today as witnesses. Councillor Scott, thank you for your submission. You say that the overwhelming body of evidence is that supply does not improve affordability. Could you please take on notice if we could get a list of that evidence? That would be very helpful. Is that okay?
I'm very happy to do that.
Thank you, Councillor Scott. You also mentioned that we shouldn't play the blame game. What is it that councils are willing to do? Because you list a number of things here. I've listed 7 things where you feel state and federal government should supply more support to councils. What is it that you think council can do to improve affordability for housing?
That's a great question. Thank you, Chair. And as you've seen in my statement, I've listed a range of different things that individual local governments are doing. Of course, there is no one solution for Australia's 537 councils. So as you'd expect, we would not all want to do exactly the same thing. That wouldn't suit the needs of our individual communities. But it is the case, as I've quoted some examples, that councils in some areas are directly investing in new affordable housing. In some cases, like my own council at the City of Sydney, we have a $10 million diverse and affordable housing fund where we partner with the private and not-for-profit sector to, again, invest in their development of new social and affordable housing. Councils, of course, do the work to zone appropriate levels of land. And when I did a recent, very non-scientific, but nevertheless important sort of show of hands of the New South Wales mayors in a particular region and said, who of you have land that is zoned for housing that's not developed? Every single one of the mayors in this particular region of New South Wales put their hand up. We know that land banking is a very significant barrier to the ability of councils to simply control the kinds of prices that we're seeing in communities. And if I'm to, with respect, Chair, call out one issue where councils are often falsely blamed, it is in the zoning of land. If you were to ask councils across the nation if they have land or they have shortages of land zoned, that's a very rare occurrence. What is often the case
so Coffs
is
Harbour,
that
you represent Coffs Harbour Council, correct?
I represent as ALGA president the New South Wales Association, which
So
represents.
Coffs Harbour has how much zoned land available at the moment?
Chair, I don't know. I don't have
The
an
answer is it
answer.
doesn't have any. Doesn't have any. So you said that supply is not, there's evidence that supply isn't the problem. So when you talk about the fund that the City of Sydney has developed for social and affordable housing, will it be buying from current supply or will it be building more supply?
Chair, it's a fund to partner with housing affordability providers. So, for example, the city has used that fund in some cases to donate land for the development of housing. In some cases, it's provided funding to support other landowners to incentivise the development of new social and affordable
So
housing.
it is about expanding. So it's about expanding supply.
Correct.
So supply does play a role.
There is no argument that supply plays a role in a complex multifactorial problem, but it is of course not the only feature of this discussion, and it is of course in many regions of New South Wales that increasing supply does not simply lead to an increased availability of affordable and social housing. It doesn't often change the price point.
So you don't believe market economics applies to the Australian housing market?
I believe that it's a very complex problem, and
but there are a lot of complex markets. There are a lot of complex markets, and supply and demand being a determiner of price doesn't change in those complex markets. But you think that isn't the case in the Australian housing market?
With respect, Chair, I know you are from the same city as me. I think we've seen a large increase in the number of available properties in a range of areas in Sydney, and yet prices continue to skyrocket. This is just simply not the evidence that we're seeing. It's not a simple correlation.
To that point, we've had the Assistant Governor of the Reserve Bank, Lucy Ellis, give evidence to us, and she has made the point that you are seeing rents and prices for apartments decline in the market when demand was withdrawn because of COVID, and we weren't able to have migration into this country. So it does seem that supply and demand has an impact on price. Is that not the case?
To be very clear, I'm not arguing it's not a factor. What I am arguing, as I clearly said, is that it is not a one-to-one correlation. It is not the only factor. There are many other factors that apply here.
Okay. I would love to keep talking with you, Councillor Scott. Unfortunately, I've run out of time. And I should pass on to the Deputy Chair, the member for Parramatta.
Thank you.
And look, thank you for your submissions. They're really, really interesting. You referred to market failure a number of times, which is really interesting because you're the first witnesses that we've had that have openly called it market failure. But I'm interested in what the answer is. I mean, you're quite right, Councillor Scott, and the other witnesses online, that there's not only one answer for each council, there's probably 10 or 20 answers for each council as well, because increasing supply means supply of what and when. You know, how do you deal with volatility, etc. You know what I'm saying here. So my question is, what does the system looks like that actually allows councils and business groups and, you know, the hydroponics companies in northern Victoria that can't get workers. What is the system that allows a range of answers that suit the needs of the community in the long term?
I'm happy to go first through you, Chair, if you'd prefer. So one of the barriers that we see on the ground, as I mentioned, is land banking. And a 2020 study found that Australia's top 12 listed residential property developers were holding land banks that constituted 13 years of supply at current rates. So this is an issue that it would be, I think, very beneficial for the committee to consider how it might best be regulated and that some consideration of the delivery of housing supply be built into land banking. Ultimately, though, Deputy Chair, of course, councils are advocating for an investment from, as I said, Commonwealth and state governments in affordable and social housing. We are very willing to play our part. Indeed, we are in a large number of areas in the nation. But without that serious investment from Commonwealth and state governments, it is the case that there will be a number of citizens of Australia, residents in our communities, that will not be able to access housing at the very lower end of the socio-economic spectrum. But more generally, and you've heard from the regions today, if there is an attempt by regions to attract key workers into their areas, housing is often the key economic barrier. And so by having government investment in social and affordable housing, it serves as an economic booster for a region to attract key workers that both help make sure our communities can have GPs and nurses and other frontline staff, but also people to grow new businesses, to risk and invest and start up a business in a region. This is good for all of us.
Could I just intervene here on regional North Queensland?
Councillor Hill, you can. I should, Julie, I'm afraid that's going to be your only question. Sorry. Councillor Hill.
There's two factors here for us that will continue to cause significant problems around the housing sector. It's the migration of Indigenous people into the major regional cities. And we're seeing people from as far away as the Northern Territory move into both Cairns and Townsville, an insufficient supply of housing. There's also insufficient supply of housing on Indigenous communities, and we know that you could have 4 generations living in one house. Now, that really needs to be addressed for my Indigenous fellow mayors north of Rocky. And can I say the problems north of Rocky are very different to the problems in southeast Queensland and in inner Melbourne and Sydney. The other problem we have here locally is we do have insufficient housing supply now because we're seeing a movement of labour. But the other problem too is Defence competes for housing here. So one of our bigger problems is we can't get banking investment outside of the capital cities. The banks are retreating and it's getting harder and harder for property developers to get investment. And with Defence then using the local market to build and rent out properties, what it's doing, it's tying up labour. And unless those sort of factors are dealt with, you'll start to see in our region anyway a continuing problem. So we have banking and insurance, and then we have the government itself in the way it ties up labour for building of defence homes. And we're seeing more and more defence people moving to the north, as I'm sure many of you are aware of the change in the way we view defence.
Can I jump in on a couple of those market failure examples? So they're two very different market failures, whether you're an inland stalled market or whether you're in a growth coastal market. I'm only talking regional here. The inland one is because the banks pay such a risk premium in a market where they can't really understand their risk exposure to a place where there's a very small number of transactions, and we're talking 1 or 2 transactions a year or less in a lot of our smaller inland places west of the Divide. And the other big gap is that the cost of rebuilding is so much more than the median cost of housing in those places. So the markets just don't work. They're completely stalled. I think there's been one house built in Mount Isa in the last 12 months. Now that's crazy in a town of 20,000 people. There's a real market failure there. In our growth areas in regions, it's more to do with, I think, that sense of diversity. We know that the markets, the consumers, the residents there want that mix of housing, and yet what the development sector is providing is typically the easy win, which is the outer sort of suburban peripheral growth. And we're not seeing that medium density even in these growth markets. That will bring the price points down. It'll slow the rate of price growth. But for some reason, those signals aren't getting through to the developers. So I think that's the market failure in those markets, in my view.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bert, over to you. Get prepared for some Queensland questions.
Thank you, Chair. And in the interest of disclosure, Mayor Hill, my family and I had the joy of living in Townsville for a number of years back in the late 90s. And sad to say I've only been back a couple of times, but I can see that Townsville has grown enormously since we lived there. I was very interested in your submission and your reference to allowing local governments to better deal with abandoned and empty properties, similar to what was introduced by the UK government, and requesting that be introduced by the Queensland government. Could you please tell the committee some more about that legislation, and how do you think that would benefit a city like Townsville, given its rapid growth as you have touched on, and maybe also benefit some other regional communities?
Thank you. So we're aware that we did some work around the different models to try and deal with housing.
Mm-hmm.
So we see a number of abandoned and empty properties here in Townsville. Obviously, the taxation regime makes it one of the ways we hear about land banking. We can also have house banking. We're looking to get powers to allow us to take enforcement action for property. And I've got to say, it's difficult enough as it is for us. We think that if we can push owners not to allow properties just to be run down and abandoned, that we can add to some of the stock that we have. Now, I have to apologise. I think we gave you some numbers in the report, the numbers of abandoned houses or poorly maintained homes. I'll give you an example. We've got one, we call him a slumlord, has over 100 properties in different names. Very rarely does he do any work to the properties, and he allows some of them to remain abandoned and to offset his tax, their tax and their land tax. So we think that if we had more powers to ensure that properties must be habitable, and we could do that through rates, a rating thing, whereby if a property is abandoned, we'll increase the rates, not decrease them, and either force them to sell the properties to people who could inhabit them, or else to do the property up and actually rent it out or do whatever they need to do. Because at the moment, one of the issues is around, as I said, the tax regime makes it very easy for people to use property as write-offs. It just causes issues.
So you've gone already through the exercise of identifying a number of those properties.
This is definitely your last question. Sorry.
Thanks, yeah.
You snuck one in.
How do you think the council, if it was given those additional powers, a bit like Councillor Scott has mentioned, I think Swan Hill Council is doing a development. Is there the capacity in the council to resume those properties and redevelop them themselves and then on-sell them at a market rate?
We could. We know that in the UK they use empty dwelling management orders. They use their rating and tax premiums and incentives, enforced sales, compulsory purchase. We can on-sell properties for back rates, and in some cases, for many people trying to get into the new home market or the home market, there's an opportunity for them to buy might be a bit run down, but at least affordable and give them an opportunity to move into these places. We don't have the powers under the state acts, and the state acts for local government vary. While for us, this is more about Queensland legislation, it's whether or not similar legislation could be enforced in New South Wales or Victoria or in any other parts of the country. I'd like the opportunity to trial that here and see if it works. I think we listed there was about over 150,000 properties looking at census data, and it had gone up to about 190, we believe, after this census, of vacant and abandoned properties around Australia. Now that's an easy one if we could make it work to at least even put half of those properties back on the market.
Thank you, Mayor Hill.
Thank you. I think we're up to Jed.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just staying on that, Mayor Hill, I think this is a very interesting issue. Do you think there's anything federally that can be done about that? I mean, there has been talk of vacancy taxes, all sorts of things like that. Have you thought about something that federally the government could do?
Well, really, you've got to look at the tax regime for property owners. I mean, I'm an investor. I have about 5 properties locally in Townsville. But all of them are rented out. For some owners and the way they structure their superannuation or various things, they're incentivised not to list properties or to allow their properties to run down. That question, I think, needs to be answered by Treasury.
Thank you. And Chair, in the interest of time, I've got lots of questions with everybody. So thank you everybody for your submissions today. They've been great. But I am actually interested, Dr. Horton, in the regional new home guarantee idea that you put forward in your submission. You explain it quite well here. Is there a chance that, like a lot of these programs we have to help people buy houses, that it could just drive costs up even further? Is there a chance of that?
Yeah, there is. Although again, this is a very unusual circumstance. These markets have stalled. So the markets where this would be most effective are the ones where there have been very, very few transactions over the last years and certainly over the last few decades. And the reason is that the deposit requirements of the banks are out of the reach of the people that want to buy those properties. So it's not so much a question of sort of kickstarting or overheating an existing market. It's actually sort of kickstarting a market that has really stalled. So I think the risks are fairly low. It follows a similar logic, I think, to the way the federal government has intervened on behalf of first home buyers and single parents. Again, the issue there is accumulating the deposit that allows them to get into the market. Exactly the same question for these would-be purchasers of these relatively low-cost properties in inland Australia. That it's the deposit that's putting them off, not the servicing of the loan.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. I'm happy to leave it there.
Well, that's good because your time is up, Jed. Can I ask Mr. Stevens if he has any questions?
I do, Chair. Sorry about that. Just a question to the Snowy Monero Council about, in your submission, Peter, you've talked about well, I've got 2 questions. Firstly, you've talked about a lack of infill development, indicating an apparent market failure. I mean, can you just expand on that slightly for us?
Well, yes, I can. As in most regional centres, there is vacant land around, and I'm talking primarily Cooma at the moment, where Snowy 2 is concentrated. In addition to the 200 lots that are in the recently approved subdivisions that have yet to be developed, there's the opportunity for both infill in terms of vacant land, and council recently sold a number of blocks with the view of trying to encourage additional housing that for whatever reason it had collected over the years. But there's also the opportunity in the larger blocks common to regional areas for secondary dwellings. But for whatever reason, and I can't necessarily identify if there's a reluctance to go down that path. There's, as with for economic return, people tend to prefer, or builders tend to prefer the ability to build multiple homes in one location, and we did actually have that with some 12 homes going up in one subdivision. But there's less interest in, if I can say, mum and dad investors in doing single dwellings as a dual lock or releasing land that they may have land banked, or for want of a better term, as an additional block they may have had adjacent to their existing house.
Thank you. And my second question was just on land banking, which has already been commented upon, and that you've mentioned in your submission something that the ACT government have done to prevent land banking and improve construction completion. I mean, are there things that the federal government could do to help prevent land banking and improve on construction completion that you can?
Yeah, it would be our view that those sorts of controls fit into the state planning environment rather than the federal one. Where we see the federal involvement is, as Councillor Hill has suggested, and Councillor Scott, is around the taxation framework, and also around the other issues that are there in terms of the skilled workforce, and also the supply of the raw materials. If somebody was to enter into a contract to build a house at the moment here in Cooma, the wait for commencement on that dwelling is up to 2 years. There is simply not enough people in this region to meet the demand for those, even for the houses that are being built. Dr. Horton might be able to address the issue of supply of materials. He recently, his institute recently ran a webinar where that was a significant topic of conversation, that there is in fact a shortage of building materials available here and across regional New South Wales generally. Those areas are very much within the federal, well, those three issues, including the taxation regime, are very much within the federal sphere, I believe.
Thank you, James. Member for Kingston Smith.
Thanks, Chair. A question to everyone, really. It relates to the land banking issue. I'm assuming that the issue with not being able to increase rates or levy additional payments on people that own that land is something to do with IPART and rate pegging and the like. So my question is, have you submitted to the various state governments that this is something that the states should legislate for to allow? And if you have, what was the response from the states?
I'm happy to take that one, Chair. Thanks for the question. The IPART and rate pegging process is unique to New South Wales, and there is also a rate process in Victoria, but nowhere else in the nation. So it is very unusual, but important to call out that councils, income and revenue generally is very much more constrained in those two jurisdictions, and New South Wales, as a result of having more than 3 decades of rate pegging, now has an infrastructure maintenance backlog that reflects that. And so the finances of New South Wales councils, when you compare them with the rest of the nation, are significantly worse off. It is the case, however, though, that as I said in my introductory remarks, that more funding for local government to do more in this space, it's in line with the needs of our communities. We know, for example, that the federal assistance grants currently are at about 0.55% of Australia's tax take. We're advocating for them to return over time to at least 1%. This is the amount they were at under the Keating government, and councils then have the capacity to, like some of the examples I've cited, do more of this work by partnering with the private or not-for-profit sector. dwellings, or indeed, of course, supporting state and government programs and these things as well. But without some of that funding, then it makes a difference. And I assure you, having approaching the end of my term as the New South Wales President and alongside the other state and territory presidents, I assure you we have a lot of conversations with state and territory jurisdictions about the importance of this as well, and the importance of state governments investing in these kinds of programs, both to maintain, not sell off and repair the public housing estate across the nation, but also to invest in a new dwelling.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sorry, we're going to have to, we've gone way over our time limit. Not way, we've gone over, sorry. Thank you to all of you for appearing today and your participation. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, please forward it to the Secretariat by the 22nd of November. You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence and will have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. The committee stands adjourned until 1:55. Thank you. This session open. I now welcome the following witnesses to give evidence from Isaac Regional Council, Regional Development Australia, Barwon Southwest, and Tatara District Council. Sorry if I've mispronounced that. Could I please ask you to, for Hansard, to please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? Isaac Regional Council.
Chair, we've got the Mayor on the WebEx, but she's not responding. I'll just follow up with her quickly if you want to continue.
All right. Mr. Bruce Anson, could you please introduce yourself?
Bruce Anson, I'm Chair of the Barwon Southwest RDA.
Thank you. And Ms. Anne Champness.
I'm Anna Champness. I'm the CEO of Tatiara District Council.
How do you say that? Sorry, Anne?
Tatiara.
Tatiana, thank you. My apologies for...
No worries.
Yes. And Anne, do we have you online?
Yeah, hi Jason, sorry about that. And
No,
Baker
that's
Mirror
all right.
was at Regional Council.
Could you, sorry, you just said it and I was talking over the top of you. Could you please state your name and capacity before, on which you appear before the committee?
Anne Baker, Mayor of Isaac Regional Council.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, everyone. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. Giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. It is important to note that although your evidence is protected by parliamentary privilege, this protection cannot be enforced outside Australia. I would now invite you to make an opening statement before we proceed to discussion. Could I please start with you, Anne?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity, and may I please acknowledge our traditional owners of the land on which we all meet across the country today, but in particular for the Isaac region is Barada people. And to be able to have the opportunity to discuss or put forward on the subject of housing affordability and the criticalness of that is an opportunity. You would be aware that we've lodged quite a detailed submission with some of our own solutions, but I'll just give an overarching background in relation to that. Housing affordability and the supply of housing is an extremely major challenge for the Isaac region and the communities within that. Our region is in the heart of the resource sector and is as well as supported by a high functioning agricultural sector. And we have an evolving, growing renewable sector as well as tourism. So while we're well known for resource, we've got a very diverse region that is currently coexisting and has been for many years. As our region experience very extreme volatility in the housing market due to the cyclic nature and the market forces that come with being a resource region. Our submission to the inquiry has outlined the key issues, our challenges, and some actions that council ourselves to date have taken in a response from a local perspective to affordable housing, as well as supply issues across the region. We continue to advocate for funding opportunities and direct housing solutions for both the Queensland and Australian government, both levels of government, state and federal. As I alluded to earlier, as a result of the volatility of the housing market, workers in vocations such as shop assistants, childcare workers, council employees, hairdressers, butchers, like the essential core community services that we all require across the country, it just becomes extremely unaffordable for service industry workers to live in regional towns. So unless one of the incomes in the household is connected to the mining industry, or the housing is provided through a package with their employment, when we're having to push back against market forces of coal prices, it's just absolutely volatile and unaffordable. So as I said, it's just goes exacerbated by the price of coal and coal developments that are happening around us. Just in reflection on COVID-19 and the pandemic, Australia absolutely relied on the workers in this region, in this sector, in terms of the mining sector. Those people did not stop going to work. They have not stopped working. We also had to, like many others, this isn't just isolated certainly to our region, but across the healthcare, cleaning, transport, education, construction, it was all very demanding work and it's very risky. So many of these workers are employed, unfortunately, under temporary conditions. That's inclusive of contractors, subcontractors, labour hire and casual workers. Now, while I understand this is about affordable housing, the condition of employment is an element, it's a trigger for whether people are qualified to borrow money. So job security is a common denominator that fits deposit to secure a mortgage. These people are they're not in stable work. They're not guaranteed a stable income, which then majority of people just don't have that sort of money. In particular, the younger age group, and our average age in the Isaac region is 33. Hence, another element to the problem. So, council itself, as a local government and an organisation, we made several recommendations within submission. I would just ask everyone to have a read through that. Along the lines, I'll just touch briefly that, because in fear of repeating it all, the fringe benefit tax concession for individuals, as is offered to organisations, stamp duty concessions, what that could look like, and introducing a regional Australian incentive scheme similar to first home buyers scheme to stimulate demand and growth, and provide confidence in land development. So another suggestion is to the federal government, to that level, national level, to look at implementing a nationally consistent approach, not dissimilar to what's been introduced in Queensland with the Stronger and Sustainable Resource Communities Act of 2017. And that provides, while it's potentially not perfect, it's a work in progress, but it took a long time to get there. and we're yet to see a whole of project start and finish under that Act, but it's certainly putting firm frameworks in place around social planning for mining projects, social planning for renewable projects, and at all stages of those projects, if that makes sense. So that's just a couple of things. I think to round out, I'm pretty confident I might be a bit over my time. I apologise, Chair. Our council is really committed to working with all levels of government and not just government, but what does a framework look like to get a consistent, sustainable, affordable housing solution for regional Australia? And I probably would like to end there and just say that this isn't going to be a problem that I feel is solved by one group. It is a community, local government, state government, and national government coming up with something that is balanced and attractive for everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, Mayor Baker. Mr. Anson, do you have?
Thanks. And like Anne, I'd like to thank the committee for giving us some time. Our region runs from Geelong to the South Australian border, about 450,000 people, and a gross regional product of 23.5 billion. It basically has three sections. Geelong, which is one of the fastest growing regions in Australia, growing at about 3%. We have the Great Ocean Road Tourist Precinct, and then we have the inland area that is growing up to 2%, from 0 to 2%. Diverse agriculture, food and energy. And it's estimated we've got 2,500 new jobs coming within the next 3 years. I'd like to focus on two areas: housing availability and enabling infrastructure. We are currently in much of the region in an actual building boom. So Warrnambool City, for example, on average issues 220 building permits a year. This year it's issued 460, and going forward it looks similar. The demand for housing is driven by employment opportunity, energy, food production and manufacturing, construction and tourism. More importantly, it's driven also by tree and seed changes, and these guys don't actually go into our workforce. So they come in, they take up a home, but they're not in our workforce, and we're short of workers, distant workers. The other concern we've got is holiday homes and Airbnb. Port Fairy, for example, a small town, 48% of the homes are on the short-term rental. Port Campbell, it's 50%, and Apollo Bay, it's 70% of the homes. So the problem is we can't get workers into our community. They are short-term rentals, not long-term rentals. In Port Fairy, there are 6, Port Fairy, Croydon, Mortlake, small towns, there are 6 properties for rent only. In Apollo Bay, there are none, and therefore they believe that there's 85 permanent jobs and 113 casual jobs that can't be filled. I heard anecdotally a property that 3 years ago was leasing for 2,500 a week in Apollo Bay, now leases for 8,000. So the problem is they can't get nurses, teachers. The bank manager had to resign because he couldn't find anywhere to live. So there's some real issues in that space. What we'd like to think that the government could look at, similar to what the Defence Corporation or Defence Housing, is anyone who enters into a long-term lease with a public sector could get additional tax returns. Whether there's also the opportunity to provide grants to local government to provide accommodation in caravan parks, etc. Our developments are different from the mining sector in that they are small businesses that don't have the ability to put in worker camps. So again, I'd like to support Anne's comment in relation to the need for some government incentive in the housing area. The other thing I'd like to quickly talk about is enabling infrastructure. Many of the smaller regional areas simply don't have the ability to invest in the connecting roads, in some cases water and sewerage facilities. So we would urge the government to look at funding local government for enabling infrastructure. And I'll give a case example again at Warrnambool. About 6 years ago, the federal government had a program. The council received 2.6 million that it put it into enabling infrastructure or connecting infrastructure. And the result of that, and the council also put in 900,000 by way of first homeowner grants. The outcome of that program was 56 housing outcomes for, and basically affordable housing, stuff 250, 300,000 bucks. For 2.6 million of federal government money, it generated 15 million in house and land development. That really helped in our social housing area. I think that's something that needs to be considered out in the rural and regional areas to facilitate land onto the market at affordable prices. Regional Australia can't afford to pay the full costs of development. And I'm not talking about the internal subdivisions, I'm talking about the connecting infrastructure. I'll finish there. I know that was a bit scattergunned and a bit fast, but I'll end there. So, but again, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Anson. Ms. Chambers.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity to present to this inquiry. So the Tatiara is a reasonably large area. It's one of the largest local government areas in South Australia, 6,500 square kilometres with 6,900 people. We have about 1,080 businesses, but only 20 of those employ more than 20 staff. And I think that's really relevant when we're considering how we might address the housing shortage. In the June quarter, our unemployment rate was 2.1%. And at the same time, we had 150 jobs advertised and 164 jobs from 75 employers that were no longer advertised because the employers had given up on recruiting staff. And the challenge is not just about recruiting staff, but also housing them. I looked at realestate.com today. Currently, there's 2 houses for rent in the whole of the Tatiara. I met a new journalist today who started work today, who's currently staying in a tent. Overnight temperatures tonight will be 5 degrees. I had a staff member who was supposed to start 4 weeks ago who decided not to take the job because they also only had the option to stay in a tent in our Cameron Park. And so we've lost a staff member ourselves. I'm hoping that the young journalist is a little bit tougher and she'll hang around for a little bit longer. The demand that we have is not just affordable rental. It's 2 to 4 bedroom homes for rent, both affordable and market rent. It's workers' accommodation, so something basic, 1 bedroom, low cost workers' accommodation. And at a later stage, I think we also need to tackle the sector of people that want to downsize or move into some retirement style living, because we currently have an incredibly large number of people, single people living in homes that are too big for them. So I think that is also something that we need to address. Why is it an issue? And I think it's been covered a fair bit in the past. We've got a slight population increase. We've got the issue that it's not commercially viable for private developers to come in and develop homes in our district because A, they don't get capital gains that they would get if they developed in the cities. They have an extremely high cost of the development that exceeds the future value of the land that they develop or the house that they develop. And we've got a partnership with the community housing provider who will take $100,000 hit to the bottom line by the time the houses that they're building with us are finished. That's for 2 4-bedroom rentals that we're building on council land. They also can access less finance if they're building in the regions. So in metro areas, they might be able to get 80 to 90% finance. In the regions, they'll only get 50%. and we have an incredibly high demand on builders. So currently, if you want to build a home with a local builder, we have a fair few, the wait is 2 to 3 years before the builders will be able to start your house. So there's some considerable challenges there. JBS Australia, which is our largest employer, they employ about 500 people, 70% of those migrants. They're a meat processor. They've just purchased the local motel at a cost of $1.85 million to accommodate Pacific Islanders that are starting to help fill some of those labour shortages. Other businesses have bought houses for their staff, or they're building homes for their staff, but that's why it's important, I think, to come back to only 20 of our businesses employ more than 20 staff. It's simple, real challenge for them to address that shortage of housing and come up with alternative ways. So we believe that there's a number of things that could be done to address the issue. One, maybe there could be something like a regional homeowner loan guarantee that would help close that finance gap from traditional lending institutions. The NIFIC is an excellent program that could be tweaked, I think, to provide some solutions. Maybe it could provide some funding to private developers, not just community housing providers. It does have the option to provide funding to local government to unlock land for development, and that is certainly something that we're interested in. But that funding currently only is available in conjunction with debt financing. So as a local government, we are not interested in the debt financing aspect. We're interested in the funding aspect to help us unlock some land for development, but we don't want to actually build the houses ourselves. So to separate those two, the funding mechanism and the debt financing mechanism, I think would really assist. And increasing the staffing capacity for the NIFIC. One of the challenges that I believe the NIFIC currently has is that they're working with really large, like $200 million projects. They do not have the capacity to work with smaller councils like us to provide something on a smaller basis, and would be really excellent if there was a way to provide that sort of support that small areas like us are able to access the NIFIC. We're also looking at infrastructure funding. We've been very fortunate. We've been working with the federal government Building Better Regions program. Last year, we received $700,000 worth of funding from Building Better Regions 4 to develop 8 new cabins at Awakeran Park. They are tourism infrastructure, but they also provide backup accommodation for people coming to the region to work, and they are just being completed now. And under Round 5, we were just successful in receiving $335,000 for the development of 8 workers' accommodation units. So I think that will also go a long way in helping address that housing shortage. For us, it's a massive investment. So Council has invested $1 million, more than $1 million, into addressing this housing shortage. Our rates revenue is $9 million. So that is a pretty substantial investment on Council's behalf to try and address this issue. When we looked at last year, JBS Australia was desperately trying to recruit 40 staff, and they couldn't access accommodation anywhere. There was not a single house for rent. We looked at the financial impact of that, and we found that the lost opportunity from having those 40 staff lost Australia $25 million in output and an additional $8 million in value add, as well as 103 jobs. So I think there's a massive cost to all of us from regions not being able to accommodate workers. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone. Committee members, it looks like we have time for one question each. My question is a pretty simple one, which is 2.5 of you, and you can guess who the 0.5 was, keep talking about market failure. Why is given there is clear demonstrable demand, why is the private sector not interested in building houses in your council areas? I'll give a call to you, Anne.
Well, there's a number of reasons. Number one, as I suggested before, there's less finance available. So as a private developer, I don't want to tie up half my equity to build a home in regional Australia. I'd rather only put 10% of my own equity into that development. So there's number one. Number two, the cost of development is more than what the development will be worth, will be valued at once it's done. We were looking at developing lots of land, will cost us about $50,000 to develop each allotment. We'll probably be able to sell them for 30 or 40. No private developer is going to make that loss on developing land.
Sorry, can you say that again? You're selling, the land costs 50
to develop because of the infrastructure that has to be put in. So by the time
so the market failure is the infrastructure is so costly.
The infrastructure cost is substantial, yes, and will exceed the value of the land.
When we talk about infrastructure, what do we, like water, electricity, roads?
Water, electricity, roads, and septic systems.
And sorry, which was
septic systems?
Oh, septic. Sorry.
Community wastewater management schemes. We've got a 22 allotment.
Yes, I know, mate. We're talking about shit. I know.
Yeah. We've got a 22 allotment subdivision in Kings that we are looking at developing, and the initial costing is about $55,000 per allotment for the development. There's no way we can sell it for that. So we're going to make a significant loss.
Okay, this is really unfortunate because I'd love to delve into that issue, but I've used my 2 minutes. Deputy Chair, member for Parramatta.
I'm happy to continue that line of questioning, actually. Jason, just keep going. That's the line. Why isn't it working? Yeah, because honestly,
Julie, I'll pass the call to you. So please.
Okay, yeah, that's cool. So if it was commercially viable, then business would be doing it. So it's obviously not commercially viable. So it's the resources, it's the development costs up front. If the cost of building is too high, so you don't have a viable market at all, essentially. So what is the answer? Are there different forms of housing? Are there different ways of looking at it, or is it simply about putting money into a loss-making project?
If I may, one of the issues in Victoria is that we apply the same standard of infrastructure requirements in rural areas as we do in the metropolitan area. So I think there's some need to think about, does every area need a footpath, particularly if you're in a small, very small rural town? So I think there's a whole lot of issues. Secondly, in the past, we all paid for the interconnecting infrastructure. Now we put almost all those costs onto the developer. And so that drives up the individual price of land. And thirdly, in most cases, and certainly in Victoria, particularly in the rural areas, rate capping has stopped or removed the ability of local communities to invest in themselves. So in actual fact, almost it comes from the developer and there's market failure. People then can't afford to do it, so they don't, or the risk is too great, or we look for government grants.
Thank you. I'm only allowed one question.
Sorry. Sorry, Julie. Bert, do you want to ask the next question?
Thanks, Chair, and it's very much along the same lines. I think this is a really interesting prospect, and probably my direction is more directed at you, Mayor Barker, but I know of several developers who have had a variety of projects in your part of the world over the years, and at various times they've done well. At other times they've done extraordinarily poorly for the reasons outlined by Ms. Champness and Mr. Anson. So from a council perspective, and talking and following on from the Deputy Chair's comments, does the council have the capacity, at least from a Queensland perspective, it's probably different in the state, to develop land and carry that cost on its balance sheet with an offset by an increased level of rates or an additional levy on the rate hold on the property owner through their rates to cover the cost?
Thanks for the question, Bert. Yeah, well, actually, from in our part of the world, can I just start by saying that we're 58,000 square kilometres, 22,500 permanent people, and on any given night we host an extra 15,000. So we fit 35,000 people we're talking about with quite a myriad of accommodation. So it can go from units to duplexes to houses to 30,000 single room camps, either approved, built and living in, or approved and unbuilt. But the cap the lending and the fluctuation in valuations is also would be reasonable to say that the valuations of the land in this part of the world go with the price of coal.
Yeah, the booms and busts in the cycle.
So the cyclic nature. So
But could the levy be, sorry to jump in, but could the levy be a fixed levy rather than a variable levy depending on the rateable value of the land?
I don't think to go to the general ratepayer. Look, we'll never say no to looking at all sorts of models. I absolutely hear and know what you're saying is that people come in, they buy, or they come in, build and buy, or build and invest. And when it's good, it's really good. But when it's bad, it's really bad. Yeah. And we can go from 150 a week to 350, and now it's going, and I've heard this on the weekend, examples of people that are going from 850 to 1,600. So their rent is doubling as they are approaching to re-sign their contracts and their leases.
Yeah.
But just I think it's important to say, council established our own, or it's an arm. It's not actually within the council. It's a non-for-profit, non-government organisation, Isaac Affordable Housing Trust, and that's run by a board where companies, when they come in with their projects and they're under an EIS, we've set up a framework where they, depending on what their project is, how many employees and what their housing plan for their people is. So we're going down that track now, because it's one thing to have a major project and it's one thing to have a very good high economic value, but a lot of these are coming with no social value. And it's an absolute, it's becoming very clear over a long period of time that communities are wilting away at the expense of large-scale economic projects. So I think we've all got a role to play, and we've all got to come together. I'm just not sure what that looks like, because it's not it's a patchwork quilt. It's not a one size fits all. And I'm glad I'm not a policymaker sitting in Canberra.
Okay.
Thanks, Mayor Barker. Thanks, Chair.
Thanks, Bert. I think I'm up to Jed. Jed, are you? Yes, Jed, sorry.
Yep. Great. Thanks, Jason. In my one question, so hard to choose. This has been a really great session. Thank you, everybody, for all the information. But I think, Ms. Champness, I'll ask you a question with regards to your submission. You make a couple of recommendations around the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation and the National Housing Infrastructure Facility. You recommend that they be separated out, I think, is what you ask, and that local governments have a better opportunity to access funding under the NIF. I thought that local governments can access funding under the National Housing Infrastructure Facility. I thought that that was okay, that you could do that. Could you just talk a little bit about that from your perspective and your submission?
Yes, absolutely. So yes, in theory, local government has the opportunity to apply under the NIF. The challenge is that, generally speaking, the NIC has been considering proposals where there is funding for the infrastructure development coupled with a debt financing option for the housing development itself. So the funding would make up maybe 20% of the development, and a large portion would be debt financing. So that is obviously not something that would work for a local government that is simply looking to unlock residential development options. So if we're just looking at developing the 22 allotments at Keith, that wouldn't quite come under this because we're not looking for debt financing. The other issue with that is also the scale that the NIF is looking at. So they're considering proposals of sort of the $200 million range. We are probably looking at something that will be a few $1 million. So we're not of the right scale for the NIF to consider. And the reason for that is that they have very limited staffing capacity, as I understand, and they simply cannot deal with a multitude of small proposals, but rather want sort of big proposals from community housing providers, for example, that may have a small component of infrastructure funding.
That's very helpful. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I think we're back to the Deputy Chair.
Very much, Jason. I just have one question. A number of you have made recommendations about assisting people to buy or build in regional areas through, tax concessions, first homeowner grants, etc. And I'm just wondering what impact you think that would have on demand. Seems to me there's a lot of people looking at moving to regional areas and building Airbnb. So is there? How do you think it would work if there was actually incentives to build in regional areas?
Yeah, it's good.
Moreton Bay Regional Council, you're not on mute, sorry. Anne, would you like to take that question of Julie? You're on mute.
Yeah, Anne Baker or Anne?
Oh, sorry. You, of course, worship you.
If I may, sorry.
Oh no, Mr. Anson's going to jump in. Go for it, Mr. Anson.
Sorry, guys. Our concern is it's a catch-22. We've got unprecedented growth. The trouble we have is a shortage of skills. And we can't bring people in out of Melbourne or those areas because we don't have accommodation. So I think the current tax decisions in relation to housing are fabulous, or the grants, absolutely fabulous, record development. Ours are still skill shortages and a focus on the affordable housing for short terms. One of the things I was thinking about before is, do we need to consider where you go into, say, Apollo Bay, lovely town, beautiful town, 70% of the homes aren't occupied. They're occupied 10 times a year. Some are on the B&B market, some are just sit and wait. Whether there needs to be, and I don't like the thought of additional taxes, but some incentive to encourage those people or those houses to be available for housing. They think there's about 250 jobs that are vacant in Apollo Bay at the moment because people can't access housing, long-term rental.
Just on that, there's a real estate agent in Melbourne that has a tax ruling that they can get, that people who rent their houses for less than the market rate can get a tax deduction on the reduction. Just letting you know that you might follow that one up. Sorry, Jason.
Through the chair,
Matt, oh, sorry, Mayor. Your Worship, you want to? Yep, please go.
Sorry, Chair. I was just going to say, yeah, well, it's interesting that all three are proposing a similar solution, but I do think there would have to be some sort of monitoring or mindfulness around supply and demand, because it would be a balance of supply to the market, if that makes sense, to your question. Because if you sort of rush out, like in our part of the world as well, there's a lot of land that is bought up by multinational corporates and banked. So it's not developed. So through our council housing committee, we're trying to expose, like we've gathered the data and the information of what is being held in the region, and now we're working towards getting the owners and the already developers that are in to do what's needed, rather than the council have to impose costs on their ratepayers and future ratepayers, when we actually know that there's been land bank for well over a decade, potentially two, and not acted on. So that's just another complication to this ever lasting problem we've all got right across Australia.
Thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Julie. Mayor, just quickly, can you take on notice? I really want to drill down on this issue, because we constantly get told about land banking, but whenever we go and look at it, it just doesn't exist. So could you, on notice, could you give us details of that so that we can absolutely, thank you. The Secretariat will be in touch with that. Sorry, Matt, you had the question.
Yeah, well, just following on from that, if there is land banking going on within your jurisdictions, why don't you levy them? Why don't you increase the rates? Why don't you put some sort of tax on them so that it's financially unviable for them to just sit on the land?
With all due respect, through the chair, then we would be, as a local government, accused of charging companies because capacity to pay.
But that doesn't make sense. I mean, they're sitting on land making money out of it. The way to discourage that and ensure that it goes to housing is to levy them. You're not levying owner occupiers, you're levying developers. I mean, you're basically forcing them into developing the land, aren't you?
Look, what I can absolutely give you through the chair is the information that we've got. It's nothing new to us in this part of the world. In terms of charging more to get them to deliver, while I don't disagree, and it's just not. I just know in my view, it's my view and how I understand things, that if we were just to charge a company or a group extra because they're not doing what we think should be done for the greater good of the social compliance of the social fabric of our region, then we'd be taken to task over that in Queensland, no doubt in my mind.
But if you've got land that you want developed for housing, then you're well within your rights to say to a developer that buys that land, you've got a certain period of time to develop that because we want housing within our community for people to live in. And if you don't develop it or put in an application for a DA to develop it within a certain period of time, then levies will start to flow because it's uneconomical use of a scarce resource. So I think that that's an entirely reasonable approach for any government authority to take.
Yeah.
And indeed, many throughout the world do.
But Matt, I know I'm not giving evidence, but how is land in Australia a scarce resource?
Well, all three of these regional councils have just said that it's scarce in terms of housing.
It's housing that's scarce through the
sorry, I shouldn't answer. Pardon me, Mayor Baker. And that was definitely your last question, Matt. That's what we got on there.
It's through the it's the housing that's scarce, and in some areas obviously there would be land, but we've got, and our land is scarce too, depending on how you're looking at it. We're surrounded by resource projects, mining leases, but there is available land in this region to be developed. And if I could just touch on that, council's well within their rights. Yes, I absolutely understand all of that, and there's rules and regs over ownership of the land, and if they're not built or constructed on in a certain period of time, then you just move on. These blocks of these large conglomerate of blocks are owned by mining companies that always have a plan to develop, and generally they're not developed, or it could be proven that they haven't been developed on because the market prices are down when the need is there. It is what it is. It's the story of our life here, and we've been on a treadmill for nearly well over 2 decades. The social fabric of the regions needs to be considered when all projects and all with this subject matter, we're talking about affordable housing, but let's start on, there's lots of other stuff, childcare, education.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to have to call it time there mostly because we're way over. Can I thank you for appearing and participating in today's hearing? Your perspectives have been very interesting, and I'm sorry we didn't have more time to delve into more of them. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, could you please forward it to the Secretariat by the 22nd of November? You will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and will have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. Thank you very much. I would now like to welcome the following witnesses to give evidence today, from the Municipal Association of Victoria, the Local Government Association of South Australia. Am I missing anyone else? Being no one else, that's good news. Sorry,
Chair,
I missed.
Chair. Yeah, we've just got the Moreton Bay Regional Council from Queensland here as well.
Thank you. Sorry, how could I forget? Could I please ask you to, could I please, for Hansard, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? We might start with Moreton Bay so I can be forgiven for my oversight.
Thank you, Chair. Peter Flannery, Mayor of Moreton Bay Regional Council in Queensland.
Greg Cimello, the CEO of Moreton Bay Regional Council.
Thank you. The Municipal Association of Victoria.
Good afternoon, everyone. Troy Edwards, Executive Director of Policy and Advocacy at the MAV.
Thank you. And from the Local Government Association of South Australia.
Yeah, Tom Corns, the Acting Policy Director.
Thank you. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attract parliamentary privilege. It is important to note that although your evidence is protected by parliamentary privilege, this protection cannot be enforced outside Australia. Could I now invite each of you to make an opening statement before we proceed to discussion? We'll go in the same order, please. Moreton Bay Council.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. And Moreton Bay Regional Council commends the committee for holding an inquiry into affordable housing and land supply in Australia. We're a little bit different, I suppose, to those other regional councils you've heard from Queensland, where we're the third largest council in Australia, representing a population base of just under 500,000 people. We're just north of Brisbane, so that gives you an indication where we are between Brisbane and the Sunshine Coast. We're pleased to make a submission through the inquiry and recognise the lack of affordable housing creates pressure on social housing wait lists and directly contributes to the growing rates of people experiencing homelessness throughout our region. Moreton Bay recognises that well-planned growth enables economic well-being, jobs, investment and regional prosperity. And a key prerequisite to achieving this growth is to deliver essential infrastructure such as road, public transport, hospitals, schools, universities and parks in places with residential development. And so to support such substantial growth, much of this essential infrastructure requires aligned long-term land use and infrastructure planning via coordinated financial models between all tiers of government. However, the process of planning for this infrastructure between the three levels of governments are often not aligned and are a lengthy process. Delayed and uncoordinated planning and delivery of essential infrastructure means that a steady pipeline of land and housing supply cannot be maintained. So this in turn places upward pressure on urban development and housing prices. And as an example, we've got of infrastructure planning across three tiers of government, how it can work or not work. We've got a great example of Caboolture West, which is one of our growth areas in the Moreton Bay region. It's going to have a population of about 63 to 70,000 people living there in the next 10 to 15 years, which is probably about the size of Mackay or Coffs Harbour, but people might be able to relate to that. To unlock that land supply in this area, we need the construction of a 57-kilometre highway virtually called the Moreton West Arterial, and it's essential for that growth to occur out there. However, despite being discussed for over a decade and identified as an important corridor in 2018, the gazettal of this corridor has still not occurred. The West Moreton Arterial is a state piece of infrastructure relying on the state and federal funding to be delivered. So my key point is achieving great housing affordability and supply is a complex task involving multitude of stakeholders, and alignment of coordination between all tiers of government to plan for and deliver essential infrastructure and central to supporting housing and affordability. It needs to be well coordinated with that growth. So there's some of my opening statements, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have for us.
Thank you. One of my team here is a rugby league tragic, and he tells me I should congratulate you for getting dolphins to Moreton Bay. Is this a thing?
Yes, we've been on that journey with the Dolphins for a number of years, and they've been accepted as the next NRL licence, commencing the end of next year. 2023 as the season kicks off, so we're very happy and excited about that.
Congratulations, mate. They never beat the Manly Warringah Sea Eagles, but anyway. On that, can I please now go to the Municipal Association of Victoria?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the committee. And as a Victorian, I guess I'll just confess I have no idea what that previous conversation was about. I'm assuming rugby league. So good afternoon, everyone, and I'll just acknowledge I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wiradjuri here on the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Look, we would commend the committee for this important piece of work, obviously making sure that we've got both the appropriate supply and demand side settings right is critical to housing affordability. And, you know, I don't need to tell the committee or other attendees today about that. I guess from our point of view, there's probably just 4 kind of key areas that perhaps we think are worth exploring as part of that conversation, particularly around the supply of social and affordable housing and the housing choices part of that, making sure that renting remains a viable option. And I think the growing preferences from the community needs to be reflected as part of that. I think trying to strike the right balance around investment and first home ownership is an important part of that, and to what extent property speculation drives that is also something we think that's worth exploring. And probably the last one is just wages growth and income support, and clearly property speculation, property growth has outstripped wages growth, and that's adding to the affordability. But they're just 4 areas we think are worth flagging in a whole host of the other complex issues, and certainly many of the ones that I just caught the last 10 minutes of listening to the previous session would all be things we're interested in as well. But I'll leave it there, Mr. Flinski.
Thank you, Mr. Edwards. And finally, the Local Government Association of South Australia.
Yeah, well, on behalf of the LGA of SA, I'd like to thank the committee for inviting us to provide evidence as part of this very important inquiry. For many years, pockets of our 68 member councils have reported policy challenges associated with inadequate supply of affordable housing options. However, in recent months, our members have reported that these challenges have become more widespread, more severe, and have been exacerbated by the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. But notwithstanding the severity of this complex public policy challenge, South Australian councils are demonstrating leadership in the face of this market failure. Many metropolitan councils are concerned about the scarcity of available affordable housing options, and as providers of community services, they're also concerned about the adverse flow-on effects this scarcity has on the increased incidence of homelessness in their communities. And the COVID-19 impact on house prices in the Adelaide metropolitan area has been well publicised. The latest CoreLogic Home Property Value Index reveals that in the year to 31 October this year, Adelaide metropolitan dwelling prices of all types increased by approximately 20.1%. But the causes of these rapidly increasing metropolitan house prices are currently being investigated by many stakeholders. However, it's worth noting that the South Australian Government's Land Supply Report for Greater Adelaide, published in June this year, established that even under a high growth population scenario, in the period to 2030 and under existing planning and zoning policies, the Greater Adelaide Planning Region has more than sufficient supply of greenfield and urban infill land to facilitate development for the estimated housing demand. Despite adequate land supply, however, several metropolitan councils have been proactive in attempting to increase the supply of affordable housing. And this often occurs through public-private partnerships with community housing providers, in which councils collaborate with the South Australian Government to provide land and essential service infrastructure, and community housing providers develop and manage the rental residential properties on behalf of councils. In regional South Australia, some of the larger councils are also experiencing noticeable increases in homelessness. However, in regional areas, councils are also acutely concerned about the economic development consequences of widespread housing shortages. In recent months, Regional Development South Australia has reported a statewide regional investment private sector pipeline of $31.2 billion projected over 5 years. However, with housing shortages mounting across regional South Australia, the evident risk is that this significant investment pipeline may not eventuate, with adverse consequences for regional economies, including reduced economic diversity, reduced regional employment, and by implication, a reduction in regional vibrancy and community wellbeing. In this light, RDSA is already reporting, quote, "There are numerous examples of businesses of all sizes that cannot grow or in some cases operate at full capacity as there is no accommodation available to house the staff they need to attract," end quote. Many of the long-running causes of regional housing supply shortages are listed in the LGASA submission, and these have been exacerbated by the COVID-19 impulse for regional interstate migration and the trades and building material shortages, which have accompanied the successful implementation of the Commonwealth Government's Home Builder program. In response to this policy challenge, some councils have taken the initiative to partner with community housing providers, South Australian government agencies and the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation to facilitate residential housing development directly. In addition, the SAROC Regional Committee of the LGASA has taken a leadership position in this space by commissioning the development of a regional housing policy toolkit, which aims to consolidate advice on innovative policy options already available to regional councils seeking to facilitate residential development and provide a policy reform advocacy agenda for the SAROC committee to take to other levels of government. This advocacy agenda is likely to include various planning reform options to encourage a greater diversity of housing types, i.e. smaller dwellings in regional townships, taxation reform options, including incentives targeted at investors and developers to build residential dwellings a minimum distance from the Adelaide CBD, and the expansion of innovative mortgage finance options such as shared equity home loans for low-income earners in regional areas. I thank the committee again and look forward to your questions.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Each of you is describing complete and utter market failure. You have a situation where you have prices getting out of control, supply not able to expand, people wanting housing, so demand existing, and people not interested in buying. Could it be that it is not possible for everyone to be able to find the land they need on which to build?
I'll take that first if you don't mind, Chair.
Please.
Look, certainly in the regional South Australian context, obviously there is a plethora of available land. The issue is whether developers can profitably invest in residential development.
Not bad, mate.
Sorry, one moment.
Yeah.
Terry, you're not on mute. Thank you. Sorry.
One of the issues, and I emphasise the points already made by Anne Champness from the Tatiara District Council, but in addition to the comments she made in the previous session, one issue is that finance being made available to both developers and lent to mortgagees, they reflect on historical real estate values. And in South Australian towns, which have been often developed over time around a single industry, when there is an investment pipeline for new industries entering into that area, historical real estate values don't reflect that private sector opportunity. So there is no mechanism currently, or often our members inform us that there is no mechanism by which real estate values, prospective real estate values, are accurately reflected for future development opportunities. So that's an example of a market failure unrelated to land release.
Sorry, how is that an example of market failure? Because they can't make a profit.
No, well, there's a difference between real constraints on profit and perceived constraints on profit. So if there are several large projects that are projected for South Australian regional areas, which will deliver jobs growth. But when you're looking at historical real estate values in certain townships, prospective real estate values or increased real estate values are not taking into consideration when considering whether to lend finance to either developers or mortgagees.
Sorry, are you saying to me that the reason people aren't building in regional areas is because they can't get a bank loan?
Certainly. Certainly, developers reflect on this all the time to our members. We hear it all the time.
So what you're saying to me is, if I went out tomorrow and started a bank or a finance company at least, and lent exclusively to regional builders, I could make a monster.
Well, the risk is around real estate values into the future. And so many South Australian towns are quite remote and quite small. And so when analysing historical real estate data, it's not a very good indicator necessarily of future real estate prices.
No, but surely banks are aware of that.
Well, one thing we're certainly hearing, particularly in the midst of the Commonwealth Government's Home Builder program, it's much easier to make developers to make profits in and around the Adelaide CBD and metropolitan area.
Okay, so there are places where they can make more money.
Yes.
Right, so this is a capacity issue.
Potentially, but the victim of this is regional economies and the growth that they're not able to realise, not because the specific private sector projects aren't viable and profitable, but because they can't house their workers. So essentially, private sector employers in other sectors away from residential development are the victims of the housing market not operating efficiently.
So I'm going to have to hand over to the very eager Deputy Chair. I mean, she's already on screen. She's already pressuring me.
So I think what you're saying is there's a lack of data and projections on the future that would allow people to make rational investment decisions over the long term. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Thank you. That's the answer, Jason. Okay, now my question. You're talking about rental rent, build to rent, which obviously needs to happen. Families should be able to enrol their kid in school and stay in the same house. Because, it doesn't work unless you can do that. So clearly you need to do that. I'm just wondering why, if there's a profit in build to rent, why we wouldn't be looking at other models like shared equity and cooperative housing, because if there's profit in it, then people should actually be able to rent to buy. Did that question not make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. This is Greg Cimello from Moreton Bay. Build to rent's interesting in Australia. I did a property council tour in the United States a couple of years ago to look at the build to rent market there. Fundamental differences to Australia, aren't they, in the cost structure?
Yeah.
So the cost of construction there seems to be something like a third or a quarter less than ours. This is before, it'd be a lot less now. And also their rental levels, particularly in the northwest coast, were double ours. So if your cost of construction's a third less and you can get twice the rent, it makes a complete amount of sense in the States why you would hold and rent compared to Australia. So I think that's been a challenge in the Australian economy with our market, with our comparative cost of construction and rental levels, notwithstanding the increase in rents lately. That still wouldn't have changed it. It still makes it, I think, pretty marginal. And I know there's a lot of folks looking at the taxation ways to make it more attractive to do that. But we don't find in South East Queensland there's many successful examples of that, and this is a very buoyant market too.
Yeah.
I can build on that, so we've seen in Victoria record investment in social and affordable housing through COVID and the state government's $5.3 billion investment, which it really picks up a lot of work being done by councils around community housing opportunities, in particular, where there's a number of models emerging trying to provide more accommodation in community, not just for low-income individuals, but certainly for those who might be experiencing social vulnerability or, for example, domestic violence scenarios where, particularly women and young children are looking to keep kids enrolled in schools in communities where perhaps the housing's traditionally been particularly expensive. So social housing offered by community housing is really taking off. The projections are that state investment of finance will go a long way to kind of probably providing the missing piece. I think there's been a lot of goodwill from all players, including the development industry, and they've been working very hard with state and local government in Victoria on that front, but probably the lack of cash has been the biggest shortcoming, and the state government should be recognised for that investment here, which we think's long overdue.
And I assume that from everything else you've said, that if governments were to increase build for rent, you'd probably try and follow where the work was needed.
Correct.
So you'd be targeting very carefully where the government is investing taxpayers' money.
Yes, and to pick up the previous question from Mr. Folinsky and perhaps some of the conversation of the previous session, the Victorian Planning Authority and councils in the southeast, in the southwest, which has been discussed. There's been a lot of work around providing accommodation for workers. I guess one of the challenges there on the supply side is some of the planning provisions and ensuring that planning scheme amendments can be provided in a timely way. And certainly, the state government targets about 25-day turnaround on planning scheme amendments, and I think it's running at about 71, 72 days. So that's some indication of the type of regulatory burden that sits there. But notwithstanding that, there probably are some constraints just on the supply side too, and we see that in the southeast of Melbourne where there are some significant growth corridors yet. Supply is, to use a technical term, I think, starting to run out because those growth corridors are starting to butt up against high value, high yield agricultural land. So, policymakers at state and local government level, I think, are then caught in the balance of how do we protect that high value agricultural land close to significant markets, but also continue to provide appropriate land supply. So it is a bit of a challenge there.
Yeah, we've watched the loss of agricultural land in the Sydney Basin. It's quite tragic. One last question, Jason, a very quick one. You're talking about the Local Government Association was talking about planning system to allow for a mixture of allotment sizes. My experience in the CBD is when they change the zoning to allow smaller allotment sizes, the price of the land goes through the roof. So it actually increases the price of everything around it. Do you have an approach which would actually allow for smaller allotment sizes without impacting on price?
Well, certainly as part of the regional housing policy toolkit, we're examining those options. Look, in terms of the planning system in South Australia, we've undergone a significant reform process in recent years whereby local councils have had a lot of the influence over the planning system transferred to the state government. So the short answer is within the metropolitan Adelaide area, where what you're suggesting could eventuate, the 30-year plan for Greater Adelaide, the land use plan, is being reviewed, and certainly we're consulting with our members around those policies, but we'll certainly take that on board as a potential adverse consequence of greater density.
Thank you. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you. I think we're over to Terry, who wants to ask Moreton Bay some questions. Terry, are you there?
Thanks, Chair. Yep, I am. Sorry, I cut out for 5 minutes.
Terry, you have 5 minutes, so remember to leave the witnesses time to answer your question.
Yes, yep, absolutely. G'day, Greg, and g'day, Peter. Good to talk to you.
Hey, Terry.
Gentlemen, just on the, as you know, North Harbour, and we've got Caboolture West, as you touched on earlier, which I did bring up earlier in the day we had representatives from the Queensland Government on the phone. As we know, constitutionally, TMR are responsible for and the state government are responsible for planning. Can you give us a bit of an idea of what you think that we can do federally that would be within our areas of responsibility to help this situation?
Yeah. So you've hit probably a vital point there where often the funding goes down to the state government level, who then want to do a number of business cases to stack up the feasibility of a project. And historically, what I've seen in Queensland is those projects then get pushed out for many, many years, even decades, of doing study after study after study to stack up whether a business case then stacks up to seeking then another pool of funding to actually construct the work. So if that red tape can be reduced, the number of business studies, business cases put, or feasibility studies, you'd only need one, whether you need it or not, and whether a cost-benefit ratio then comes into play of we need to build this piece of infrastructure, we need to build it now and get it done with, rather than pushing it out year after year after year, and then the cost of that infrastructure ends up blowing out many millions of dollars that we're seeing now with some of our infrastructure and some of these major roads. So the ability to streamline that process, whether there's, I often see the federal government giving a bucket of money to the state governments in Queensland, and there's no timeline seem to be fixed to that, and it just drags out beyond everybody's expectations, and the community runs out of patience and don't believe any infrastructure is going to be delivered because they're not seeing any bitumen on the roads being put down on the ground. So, if there's some way that process can be streamlined, whether, then local governments at our size and our capabilities can often deliver these projects a lot quicker, more efficient and cheaper than what some of our state government colleagues can be. So it needs to be more of a tripartisan kind of agreement with some of this infrastructure where local governments can get in and deliver it quicker and streamline that whole process. Even we lead on some of these projects at the moment, and you probably found with the West Moreton there that we've done a lot of the works that are leading the state government down the same path. But if we weren't involved, it still would be delaying that process for many decades to come. I
think what the Mayor's described is, the city deal, in essence, is a great avenue of doing that. So getting the three levels of government to work together in a much more constructive way. In South East Queensland, I think the average delay from when a land is zoned residential to when it actually becomes residential, some years ago some work was done, was about 8 to 12 years delay in that process. And part of that is all the planning approvals, obviously the necessary planning approvals, but then the sequence of almost never-ending business cases that both state and federal governments seem to want to do, separate to each other often too. For a piece of infrastructure that, as the Mayor said, a cost-benefit analysis will quickly show is needed. And the introductory comment the Mayor made about would you build a city the size of Coffs Harbour without a main road to it? Well, the answer is clearly no. So let's get on with it a bit faster.
Or a rail line.
Okay, I'm going to pass. Jed has indicated that she has no questions on this session. Matt, are you still there? Maybe in that case, Bert, if you have any questions, 5 minutes.
Well, thanks, Chair, and thank you, Peter and Greg. I sort of was leaving this to Terry, given that he's your local federal member, but I have mentioned to him a couple of times my concern about Caboolture West, given my experience with Flagstone and Yarrabilba. And can I say, I've just had a look at the proposals on the TMR website for that western corridor. They seem to be roads to nowhere. So I feel for you guys, if this planning is not undertaken properly, as I've said to the member for Longman, it could be an unmitigated disaster. But that sort of brings me to my question. Why is it that state governments give these approvals for these priority development areas? And I'm pretty sure Caboolture West is also a PDA. I'll stand to be corrected if that's not the case. Without the associated planning of all the related infrastructure that's required, whether it's jobs, roads, rail. I know they spoke this morning about schools, etc. But they also said if people start hopping in their cars and then you build a rail line later on, as we're seeing out at Springfield and we're seeing down at Flagstone, you won't get them out of the car back onto the train. So how can we stop those problems before they occur? And how much power do you as councils have to do that?
Thanks. Yeah, in this instance, sorry, it's not a priority development area. It is part of the council's planning scheme.
Okay.
So it's a little bit different, but the fundamental principles are very much the same. In my mind, though, and I've come at a previous background in the state, so I had the job that Kerry Doss has now. We spoke to Kerry Doss earlier on today. The planning tends to be done in a general sense. So there is the long-term infrastructure planning and the school locations and all those sorts of community facilities that tends to be done. The issue from my perspective, though, is there's a massive disconnect between planning, as in putting the colours and the lines on a map, and the reality of funding and building the stuff. So that's where it breaks down. I don't think there's a lack of initial strategic planning for most of these growth areas, if not all of them, and including Caboolture West. There's planning, and there is a plan about a public transport corridor back to Caboolture you might be aware of. We haven't got the road gazetted, we haven't got the corridor gazetted for public transport, we haven't got agreement with Department of Transport and Main Roads about the public transport solution for Caboolture West. So if the planning tends to be done out there, but then it stops, and then we go in this cycle of either nothing or business case after business case, trying to find a better solution, and that's the key problem, I think, from my point of view.
Yeah, I think I said that the planning games go on and on and on, and funding gets allocated with all best intentions to get in an outcome and then maybe go to construction and build it. But the planning seems just keeps going on and on and on, and then it chews up all that funding that was available for the planning and maybe construction. And then you're chasing another bucket of money down the track for construction, which has many different competing projects. I think if there's some timelines brought into it, in my opinion, if you brought some timelines into it saying that you had to have a business case by this date, planning designed by this date and constructed by a certain date, it would make everybody work backwards from that completion date. It's really like the Olympics, where we've got to have infrastructure in place by 2032. So we're going to start working backwards and forcing us to all levels of government, I suppose, to react a lot quicker than what they've traditionally done, where we get these residential estates happening and then the main roads connecting with that, and infrastructure comes a lot later, and that's how it's always been, decades later. And to get everybody on the same page to agree to move forward with some of these projects, that major infrastructure has to be part of that initial stage, and commitment needs to be put up front for financing the construction of that infrastructure, maybe before the people are there and even before it's needed. So it's build it and they will come kind of thing, rather than they've come and now we're chasing our tail trying to retrofit a lot of development for this infrastructure down the track. It causes the heartache and headaches, as you probably know on your side of town too there, Bert.
Chair, or have I got a bit more time?
2 minutes. That's
2
it.
minutes.
That's it.
So if all that pre-planning is done, because obviously the focus of this inquiry is about housing affordability, how do you think getting those basic principles right will then improve the affordability of housing for the people that are moving to those areas? And also, as part of that, you get the right mix of housing that makes it affordable.
I think it comes down to the old adage that time is money. So if you think about the 8 to 12 to 15 year delay, that often occurs at the time the land is zoned to when it becomes reality. You know, as a planners tend to say we've got that much available land when it's coloured pink on a map. Well, that's not simply true. You know, it's only available land when it's ready to be built on. So if you can compress that time, the way the Mayor talked about the business cases and coordinated investment, that reduces prices. And when you do the maths in terms of the development costs of adding on this time, and if you can shrink 8 years to 4 years, that's actually a massive saving. And that's not savings at all pocketed by developers, notwithstanding what some people may think. That'd be savings passed on and reduced cost of housing. Part of the process too in South East Queensland is the issue that people have with development is not so much development per se, but the fact that infrastructure isn't there. They're worried about the traffic congestion that goes with it, and they want the parks and the schools with it. So if we could guarantee that they were co-provided, that would lessen the angst in a large part of the community. The whole development assessment process becomes faster too. So that coordinated delivery of infrastructure really solves a couple of things by speeding up the development timeframes, and that reduces the cost, we think, of development.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, committee members. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, could you please forward it to the Secretariat by the 22nd of November? If you will be sent a copy of the transcript of your evidence, and we'll have an opportunity to request corrections to transcription errors. I'd like to thank members and witnesses for their time today and declare this public hearing closed. See you all again on Wednesday. Thank you.